They buried it where no one would find it. Not beneath a temple or in some gilded reliquary, but deep behind a crumbling altar wall sealed in lead and lime, hidden for 7 centuries. And when the box was pried open in 2001, what they found didn't just unsettle the archaeologists, it terrified them. Inside was a disc, metallic, cold, engraved with a design no Templar symbol was ever meant to bear. A symbol that described a date, our date, and a prophecy. One the church tried to erase. One the Templars died to protect. They called it the last sigil. So tonight we travel back, not just through time, but into a long erased corner of medieval silence. The kind carved in whispers, coded in stars, and buried under centuries of stone. You're not just listening to a mystery, you're stepping into one. Gently now. Let's begin. You can almost hear it, can't you? The slow creak of iron doors opening to a chapel that hasn't seen light in 500 years. Dust hangs like incense in the air. Every brick breathes secrets. And behind the altar, a stone worn soft by centuries of forgotten prayers, there's something off. The symmetry is wrong. The lines of the masonry don't quite match. And in 2001, when a team of local restorationists in Languedoc noticed that uneven stonework, they did what no one else had dared. They broke it open. What they discovered behind that wall would set off a chain of silent ripples through private ecclesiastical archives, clandestine academic circles, and eventually the hands of a Vatican conservator who refused to stay quiet. A small box, lead-sealed, medieval, untouched. Inside a single object. Not parchment, not a chalice. A disc, roughly the size of a man's palm, crafted from an alloy that still resists definitive analysis and etched with markings no known Templar order should have used. In its center, a 6-armed cross, broken, twisted. Radiating out from that center were sigils of an entirely different nature. Astronomical, celestial, and some say prophetic. The artifact now known as the last sigil doesn't just defy categorization, it defies time. Because embedded in its symbolic system, encoded in a cipher so obscure it hadn't been referenced in over 600 years, was a date. A very specific one. Not from the past, but from our very near future. This is not the usual Templar mythos. We won't waste time tonight wandering off into tangents about grails or lost bloodlines. This isn't a story about what the Templars might have found. It's about what they tried to hide and how they may have encoded the end of an age into a metal disc no wider than a saucer. Because if this artifact is real, and every indication says that it is, then it doesn't just reveal what the Templars believed about time prophecy and the heavens. It shows that they may have seen something coming, something terrifying, something inevitable. So keep the lights low. Let the shadows fall where they may. And before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because tonight we begin an investigation that crosses continents, centuries, and cosmologies. We'll dig into forgotten manuscripts, long-suppressed Vatican records, cryptographic patterns, and astronomical alignments, once known only to a vanishing priesthood. At the heart of it all, one sigil, one prophecy, and one unavoidable question. What happens when the countdown reaches 0? You can still visit the chapel. It's a modest structure tucked away in the French countryside near Bézieux, close to the crumbled footprint of what was once a Templar commandery. Most who pass by wouldn't give it a second glance. Its roof has long since sagged, moss crawls up the stone like sleepwalking ivy, and the bell tower hasn't held a bell in 200 years. But beneath this fading ruin lies a riddle whose implications reach far beyond its lichen-streaked walls. It was in the spring of 2001 when the restoration team arrived, funded quietly, almost anonymously, through a preservation grant not listed on any public registry. Their stated purpose was structural reinforcement and preservation photography. But the team brought with them more than scaffolding and brushes. Among them was Dr. Hervé Langlois, a medieval symbologist from Marseille, known for his unorthodox theories on Templar communications. He wasn't listed as an official archaeologist, nor was he ever mentioned in the site's paperwork. Yet by the third day, it was he who halted the work. The reason was simple: the altar wall wasn't original, or rather it was suspiciously new, dating to the early 14th century, shortly after the dissolution of the Templar order. Its stones were cleaner, the mortar less degraded, and when gently tapped, the wall gave back a sound far too hollow for a solid barrier. Beneath it, a cavity waited, a cavity someone had sealed up centuries ago. The process of dismantling the false wall took the better part of 2 days, done mostly in silence under torchlight. Behind it lay a small alcove carved directly into the bedrock. At its center sat the leaden box, completely sealed with no visible hinge or lock. It had been wrapped tightly in fragments of what appeared to be silk, a luxury in medieval France, and held in place by rusted copper brackets. According to Langlois, when they opened it, the room fell utterly silent. The only thing inside was the disc. It was heavier than it looked, slightly warm to the touch, and bore an unclassifiable metallic composition. Some called it tin. Others suggested a complex alloy, including antimony or lead. One even whispered the word meteoric, though no tests have confirmed that. What mattered more than its material was what lay across its surface: a network of engravings that radiated with eerie precision. There was no Latin, no inscription, just the visual language of power geometry and hidden time. At the center, the unmistakable red cross of the Knights Templar, but with 6 arms, not 4. One of them broken, splintered, as if shattered deliberately. Around it, a ring of symbols echoing ancient planetary glyphs, yet subtly altered, off by a fraction, like a shadow version of the sky. Langlois took hundreds of photographs, but those images were never released. The official report filed with the Ministry of Culture omitted the find entirely. And just 3 months later, Langlois resigned his academic post, left Marseille, and reportedly relocated to a monastic retreat in Corsica. He has not spoken publicly since. What we do know comes from a brief window in 2002, when a handful of low-resolution scans from his notes surfaced online. Quickly dismissed as elaborate hoaxes, they've since vanished from most digital archives, but they confirm one thing: the object was real, and it matched no known Templar artifact ever catalogued. The most curious feature wasn't the central cross or the strange planetary glyphs, it was the outer ring. A precise arrangement of notches, nearly microscopic, forming what some believe to be a cipher. Specifically, a substitution code linked to astronomical ephemerides tables once used to track celestial bodies across the heavens. When loosely decoded, the sequence aligns with planetary movements leading up to the year 2039, a date you'll want to remember. Historically speaking, Languedoc was no stranger to secrets. It had been a stronghold for Cathar's Templars and heretics alike. The town of Rennes-le-Château, just a few miles away, has inspired centuries of occult speculation. But unlike those myth-choked stories of grails and gold, this disc has no treasure map, no royal bloodline. Its message is colder, more precise. Not where, but when. The obscure detail here, the one nearly every follow-up account misses, is this: the disc was not placed in the box loosely. It was set into a velvet-lined groove. That groove matched the disc's curvature perfectly, suggesting it was designed for transport. It wasn't hidden to be forgotten. It was hidden to be protected, preserved until the right eyes found it, or until the right time. That raises an uncomfortable question, one that scholars still debate quietly behind closed doors. Was the disc sealed behind that altar to keep it from the church, or to keep it from us? Because the church, it turns out, has never acknowledged the object. No official records, no conservatory samples, no museum holdings. The Vatican has denied involvement. Yet within 2 weeks of the discovery, a previously unknown cardinal arrived in Bézieux with diplomatic credentials. The site was shut down the following morning, and the disc, if reports are accurate, was never catalogued into any known institutional archive. This silence speaks volumes, not just about the artifact itself, but about what it may represent. A final message from an order long extinguished. A silent scream encoded in geometry and buried in stone. Waiting. And perhaps more chillingly, waiting for now. You lean in closer. Not physically perhaps, but mentally, you feel yourself narrowing toward it, toward the object. The disc, this strange metallic whisper from the 14th century, seems to pull you in the way a lock yearns for the right key. From a distance, it resembles a wheel or perhaps an ornate seal. But once your eyes adjust to its surface, the deeper pattern emerges, not just design, but intention. Someone made this to speak across time. The first to attempt decoding it wasn't a priest or a cryptographer, but a German astrophysicist moonlighting as a medieval hobbyist. Klaus Ehrenfeld, retired from the Max Planck Institute, spent nearly 2 years tracing and retracing the symbols around the disc's outer edge using scans leaked from Langlois' 2002 notes. He wasn't interested in theology, he was after data. To his surprise, what looked like random etchings at first began to form a sequence of intervals. Ehrenfeld mapped the notches against known planetary cycles and realized something strange: they didn't track the past. They projected into the future. Specifically, the glyph sequence aligned most closely with what is called a syzygy, a rare celestial event where 3 or more planetary bodies line up in a straight configuration. The sequence on the sigil didn't match just any syzygy, but one predicted to occur in early August of 2039 when Mercury, Mars, and Saturn will cross into a near-triadic configuration near the constellation Virgo. In itself, that's interesting. But what chilled Ehrenfeld and eventually drove him to abruptly cut contact with his collaborators was what happened next. When he laid the sigil's markings over that projected sky map, something fell into place. The inner engravings, not the planetary glyphs, but the angular patterns between them, mapped perfectly onto the relative positions of the 3 celestial bodies, the broken 6th arm of the cross. It pointed with uncanny precision to the moment of maximum alignment. It was as if the disc had been made not to represent an idea, but to mark a moment that hadn't happened yet. The outer ring of the disc, so fine it appears ornamental, also caught attention. Upon magnification, it revealed a ripple-like texturing inconsistent with hand engraving. Theories vary. Some say it was done with a rudimentary lathe. Others insist it was impressed using a mold, possibly cast. But the pattern itself doesn't follow decorative norms of the period. Instead, it mimics the form of what's now known as a Lissajous curve, a kind of oscillating waveform produced by harmonic motion. But that concept wasn't named until the 19th century. The presence of such a pattern in a 14th century artifact would be troubling, if authentic. Which brings us to the most controversial interpretation that the sigil is not just symbolic, but functional. Some believe it's an astrolabe, a primitive device for astronomical calculation. But others push further. Too far, perhaps. They claim it's a kind of encoded countdown, a temporal trigger whose purpose is to mark a celestial event with spiritual or even existential consequence. It's not a map. It's a warning. A clock. Of course, that's where the scholarly debate gets heated. The sigil lacks any overt inscription, no Latin, no Hebrew, not even the stylized Gothic script common to late Templar liturgy. It speaks only in symbols and patterns, which makes it perfect for multiple interpretations and ripe for misuse. One camp argues it's simply a devotional tool. Another insists it's a ritual marker. But then there are those who suggest it points to something altogether stranger, that the Templars had knowledge of celestial rhythms centuries beyond their era. That they weren't just crusaders, they were cosmic archivists. It's a seductive idea, but it rests on one pivotal question no one has answered. If the sigil truly encodes a future date, then how could a group of 14th century warrior monks have calculated a planetary alignment nearly 700 years in advance without telescopes, without computers, without access to ephemeris tables that wouldn't exist for centuries? That's the heart of the debate. Some point to Islamic astronomical influences the Templars did, after all, maintain contact with Muslim scholars during the Crusades. Others argue for lost Greek manuscripts transmitted through Byzantine intermediaries. But even these sources lack the precision encoded on the disc. The callback to Langlois here is unavoidable. His own unpublished notes, recovered briefly before his retreat into silence, hinted at a lost cipher used among high-ranking Templar initiates, a geometric language composed of angles, ratios, and proportional harmonics. Langlois called it the initiate's syntax, and though the term has never appeared in known Templar documents, it offers a clue. If the sigil operates through such a cipher, it may not use language as we know it at all. It may speak in time. One detail that continues to haunt researchers is the central axis of the disc. There's a slight indentation barely perceptible that suggests the sigil was meant to spin. Not freely, but with deliberate effort, like a combination dial. It's the kind of thing you don't notice until someone points it out. And once you do, you can't unsee it. The idea of a spinning disc that aligns with celestial configurations isn't entirely fictional. Ancient Mesopotamian star maps sometimes incorporated movable parts. But the Templars, that would require an entirely different kind of historical framework, one where they weren't just importing relics from the East, but knowledge. Forbidden knowledge. One theory posits that the sigil is the surviving piece of a larger apparatus, a modular mechanism, a ritual machine. If that's true, then what we've found isn't the whole thing, it's the key. And like any key, its meaning lies not just in its form, but in what it's meant to unlock. So here we are, a disc that maps the future, that encodes geometry before geometry had a name, and that may in some dreadful way have been counting down to a moment not of discovery, but of convergence. A convergence we are rushing toward. You've seen the cross before. Haven't you? Broad arms flared at the ends, a vivid crimson against white, clean, symmetrical, resolute. The Templar cross. It's one of the most recognized symbols in the Western esoteric canon, etched into countless altars, tombs, and banners. But here on the disc, it's wrong. Or rather, it's wounded. At its core, the last sigil bears that same iconic shape, but with 6 arms instead of 4. The 2 extras don't stretch cleanly, they slant downward, asymmetrical, and one appears fractured at the joint, deliberately chipped. Not eroded, not weathered, broken. As if to suggest, it was never meant to stand complete. Templar historians have puzzled over the 6-armed variant for decades. It does not appear in any officially sanctioned insignia, and it doesn't match any heraldic forms used by recognized military orders of the Crusades, and yet traces of it emerge in strange places, carved faintly into stones, in abandoned Pyrenean watchposts, sketched on vellum scraps from confiscated trial records, and once unearthed beneath a ruined commandery in Portugal in the form of a sandstone relief so weathered that only its unnatural symmetry hinted at something intentional. Here's where things get uncomfortable. In Templar symbology, the cross wasn't just a badge, it was a metaphysical diagram. The four arms represented the cardinal directions, the four evangelists, the elemental pillars of their theology. But this distorted version violates that sacred geometry. It tilts the balance, introduces an unnatural axis. So what does the sixth arm represent, and why was it broken? Some researchers believe it's not a sixth arm at all, but an axis mundi, a vertical anchor representing the descent of the divine into matter. In that framework, the break isn't damage, it's drama, a symbol of divine interruption, a collapse in the celestial order. Others suggest a simpler explanation, that it was an esoteric reference, an inner circle cipher never meant for external eyes. The real meanings, they argue, were layered in levels, one for the public, one for the order, and one for the initiated few. But a more troubling theory has begun to circulate quietly, cautiously. It suggests that the cross's fractured state may depict not just symbolic imbalance, but cosmological rupture. That is, the sigil isn't representing the order. It's representing an event. Let's back up for a moment. In 1307, when King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Templars, most historians agree that the political motivation was wealth. Philip was broke. The Templars were rich. But some testimonies from the infamous trials, particularly those conducted under torture, contained bizarre claims. Initiates described ritual processions in which a cross was desecrated or altered or even corrected. One document speaks of a false sign with 6 wings carried into the chamber of rites. Most dismissed this as psychological rambling under duress. But if we accept for a moment that some core within the order held beliefs outside the Church's orthodoxy, the 6-armed cross takes on a darker meaning. It becomes a forbidden symbol, a sign not of salvation, but of something else, something the Church feared enough to erase. There's an obscure detail here that deserves attention. In 1903, a fragmentary parchment surfaced in Avignon, written in Old Occitan, now referred to as the Codex Rubeus. It describes a splinter group of Templars known as the Vigilants of the Broken Arm. Their existence is debated, and most believe the document to be a forgery. But it references a ritual object, a sigil of metal with 6 points, one shattered, as a reminder of the breach to come. That phrase, the breach to come, has sparked no small amount of speculation. Was it metaphorical, prophetic? An encoded reference to a specific event? Let's not forget Ehrenfeld's decoding of the planetary alignment. If the broken arm correlates to a specific position in that formation, then the damage isn't incidental, it's intentional. A marker, a countdown. The scholarly debate, as you might expect, is vicious. Some scholars argue that the 6th point was simply a stylized flourish, ornamental, not significant. But those same scholars have had difficulty explaining why it never appears on any other known artifacts outside this singular thread of suppressed symbols. One theologian even suggested the sigil could be a heretical reinterpretation of the cruciform and inversion of the resurrection narrative. Instead of 4 arms of balance, 6 points of disruption. Instead of ascent, fragmentation. And then there's the shape itself. When mapped out geometrically, the 6-armed cross on the sigil forms a near-perfect overlay with a collapsed stellation diagram. Specifically, it mimics a distorted hexagram in which one angle has been mathematically folded inward. a structural impossibility in classical geometry. But not in symbolic language. Some have compared it to a fallen star, something once radiant, now bent out of alignment. What does that mean? If you ask the esoterics, they'll tell you it points to the fall of a guiding intelligence, not Luciferian in the traditional sense, but the loss of a cosmic axis, a turning away of the divine mechanism that keeps time, matter, and soul in harmony. That's a lot to lay on a little metal disc. But then again, this isn't just any metal disc. This is the last sigil. And here's the callback you might have sensed was coming. Remember that indentation we discussed earlier, the one suggesting the disc was made to spin when rotated around its central axis? The six-armed cross doesn't create a uniform shape. Instead, it generates a stuttered waveform, a pulsation. The broken arm causes a visual skip, almost like a machine with one gear out of sync. Could that skip be the message the Templars may have believed in the perfect symmetry of the cosmos until they saw something that shattered that faith? Something they encoded into their final artifact. Something they broke their own cross to warn us about. And now that brokenness spins again, faster than ever. It didn't look like much at first. Just another parchment fragment from a collection of judicial archives buried in a dusty storeroom near Toulouse. The edges were frayed, the ink half faded, and the Latin so corrupted it seemed to collapse in on itself. But buried in those jagged phrases was a name. Not a saint, not a knight, but a brother, an initiate. A man who would become the center of one of the strangest disappearances in Templar history. His name, if it ever was his true name, appeared only once in surviving records: Frater Leontius. Not a Grand Master, not a ranking dignitary, just a footnote. A monk who reportedly fled his station in 1307, just weeks before the mass arrest of the Templar leadership. The record doesn't describe him as a traitor or a heretic. Instead, in a tone both restrained and terrified, it labels him with a peculiar phrase, custos ultimi signaculi, guardian of the last sigil. For years, historians dismissed this title as a misreading, perhaps referring to a lost charter seal or an esoteric term for relic keeping. But when that same phrase appeared again, decades later, in a separate ecclesiastical margin note, this time buried within an inventory of confiscated Templar items taken to Avignon, it caught the attention of a much smaller, more curious group, the Sigil investigators. The note referred to an item of anomalous design, designated as too heretical for open display and marked for discreet disposal. But beside that terse description was a single word, intactus. Untouched, the item had not been destroyed. It had been spared, and just beneath that, a short phrase scrawled by a different hand, not to be shown to the fathers. Now this would all be speculative, rambling, vague inventory gibberish, were it not for what surfaced in 1993. That year, a private library acquisition in Arles turned up a previously uncatalogued 14-page codex, handwritten in Latin, mixed with Provençal, bound in aged goatskin and bearing no title. It would later be dubbed the Manuscript of the Lost Brother. Its authorship is unsigned, but the internal voice of the text refers repeatedly to my exile from the order and describes a forbidden object entrusted to my flesh alone. The manuscript details a frantic flight through the Pyrenees, the burial of the circle that speaks, and cryptic instructions that read more like desperate warnings than theological prose. One passage has been translated roughly as, "The sign is not a symbol, it is a sentence, spoken not with voice, but with sky. When the sixth light breaks and the host turns away, none shall be ready." The odd phrasing and syntax, likely the result of unpolished Latin or mental distress, has left scholars arguing over its proper interpretation. Some view it as a poetic lamentation. Others believe it describes an astronomical phenomenon, the sixth light, possibly a planetary body or comet, and the host, as a metaphysical presence, perhaps even divine. What is striking is the manuscript's repeated insistence that the object was never meant for the common rite, and must be kept beyond even the reach of high initiates. It also references a curious ritual, the silencing of the sixth arm. This rite, if it ever occurred, is described only in fragmentary form. It involved the extinguishing of 6 candles placed around a sigil during an eclipse, after which the 6th candle was not merely snuffed, but shattered. It was not symbolic. It was a sealing, a breaking of contact. The manuscript then veers sharply into a paranoid register. The author describes visions of mirrored eyes in the stars and refers to a coming concordance of the ends. These phrases, alien as they sound, echo certain apocalyptic writings found centuries earlier among Gnostic and Manichaean sects, particularly those obsessed with heavenly alignments and cosmological judgment. What lends the document credibility despite its near-mystical tone is its direct reference to a Templar location later confirmed through independent records. The site, a ruined sanctuary near Montségur, is described as the final hollow where I laid the circle down and folded the stone behind me. Excavations in 1997 revealed a sealed chamber beneath that very sanctuary, empty when opened save for 2 things: a velvet-lined recess in the stone and a single broken copper hinge. A hinge that matches the description from the Bézout box. This callback forces us to reconsider the chain of custody. If Frater Leontius, this lost brother, truly fled with the sigil and buried it in Montségur, then someone must have exhumed it later and moved it to Bézout. The time gap is vast, nearly 7 centuries. So the question becomes, who kept it safe? Who knew, who continued the vigil? That's where the manuscript offers its most haunting suggestion. In its final page, badly burned but still legible, the author writes, "They who watch are not seen. They need no name. They are the eyes between chapters. This is the obscure detail." A reference to a hidden lineage guardians, perhaps, whose existence is never openly acknowledged. The Church has no record of them. The Templar registry, fragmented as it is, makes no mention of a sect within a sect. And yet the idea persists, that while the order burned and collapsed under charges of heresy, a silent few simply vanished, not into death, but into waiting. The open question now facing scholars is whether this manuscript is genuine. Paleographic dating places it plausibly in the early 14th century. But the lack of provenance, the obscure dialect, and the unsettling apocalyptic tone have kept it out of mainstream canon. Still, the artifact evidence from Montségur, the coded references in church archives, and the uncanny consistency with the object discovered in Bézout point to a spine-chilling possibility: the manuscript is real. And the sigil's journey, far from random, was guided by human hands across centuries. If so, we're not dealing with a relic lost to time. We're dealing with a message meant to survive it. It begins with a shape in the sky. Not one you would notice immediately unless you had reason to look. Unless you had a sigil, an object so old it predates telescopes, yet so precise it foretells the invisible. A configuration of planets forming not a myth but a mark. One that hasn't appeared in nearly 700 years and will only appear again in 2039. Now you've heard of alignments before. The New Age crowd loves them: Venus, this Mercury that portals vortexes, solar flares. But this one is different. This one isn't about vague energies or wishful vibrations. It's a mathematically precise, astronomically inevitable arrangement that unfolds like a celestial lock clicking into place. And the sigil, the disc we keep returning to like a gravitational pull, contains within its markings the blueprint for this very moment. Let's go back to that outer ring again. Remember Ehrenfeld, the German astrophysicist, who realized the sigil's etchings mapped a syzygy. Well, his calculations didn't just line up with some minor planetary waltz. They locked onto a very specific formation predicted for August 4th, 2039. On that date, Mercury, Mars, and Saturn will align in an unusually tight triangle near the Virgo-Leo boundary, one of the most mythologically loaded regions of the sky. And if the sigil's radial lines are interpreted as angular divisions, they intersect this very constellation with unnerving accuracy. Some might shrug and say, sure, planetary alignments happen all the time. And they do. But this one mirrors another that occurred in 1347, precisely 728 years earlier. You may remember that date. It was the beginning of the Black Death in Europe. And while correlation is not causation, the Templars may not have cared. To them, patterns in the sky were echoes, warnings, the music of heaven repeating its refrains. Now here's where it gets spooky. In certain suppressed Templar texts, mostly fragments preserved in the Vatican's restricted archive, there are veiled references to what they called the Great Convergence. This phrase appears in connection with celestial observations, but the texts are maddeningly vague. They speak of the stars lining their heads once more, and the shadow of Mars upon the countenance of the lion. Most scholars dismiss these lines as poetic nonsense, but when viewed alongside the sigil's alignments, they begin to coalesce into something more coherent. One phrase stands out. When Saturn lowers his crown in Virgo, the seal shall stir. You don't have to believe in prophecy to be rattled by that. Saturn will indeed be entering Virgo during the 2039 alignment. Coincidence, perhaps. But there's more. One of the outermost rings of the sigil is engraved with a small series of indentations, 28 of them. At first, they were thought to represent lunar phases, but someone noticed something odd. When lined up with the ephemerides of 2039, the indentations correlate precisely with the planetary transits for that month. Not approximate. Precise. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. The disk wasn't just encoded with star maps. It may have been designed to activate symbolically or ritually when those conditions were met. A celestial switch, a kind of astrological doomsday clock, with its hour hand now crawling toward midnight. This, of course, brings us to the prophecy itself. Now, I know what you're thinking. Prophecy is a tricky word. It implies prediction, certainty. And history is filled with bad predictions. But prophecy in the medieval mind wasn't necessarily about seeing the future. It was about recognizing recurring cycles. History to them wasn't linear. It moved like the heavens round and round. And when the same celestial chords were struck, the same consequences followed. A minor scroll found in the archives of Toledo, dated roughly 1325, bears an eerie verse in Latin: quum stellae rediunt, in ordinem fractum et sextus lumen, secideret tunc lux versa erit, in ferrum et sigillum ultimum clamabit. Loosely translated, when the stars return to the broken order, and the sixth light falls, then shall light turn to iron, and the last sigil shall cry out. Obscure detail, definitely. But when you cross-reference the sixth light with the sigil's broken sixth arm, suddenly it doesn't sound like symbolic fluff. It sounds like someone knew that a particular celestial pattern meant something, that it triggered something. The scholarly debate around this passage continues. Some say the light turned to iron is a reference to war. Others believe it's alchemical, the transformation of spirit into matter, or vice versa. A few even suggest it refers to magnetism, although that interpretation is understandably fringe. What is clear, however, is the repeated language of return, of something coming back. Not just stars, but conditions, events, consequences. Remember Frater Leontius, the lost brother. His manuscript hinted at something similar, that the sigil was not a relic but a sentence. Not a message about a moment in time, but a moment itself encoded, frozen, waiting to be spoken aloud by the stars. And perhaps now we understand why he fled, why he buried the object, why someone retrieved it and resealed it in Bézieux. Because the prophecy wasn't about their time, it was about ours. You might expect some modern commentary here, maybe a skeptical aside or a joke to cool the mood. But I'll be honest, this part doesn't feel funny. There's something eerie about staring up at the stars, knowing they'll soon fall into place like keys in a lock. Something final about it. Because while we argue over what the sigil means, the sky moves on. It doesn't care what we believe. It just keeps turning. They burned him slowly. March 18, 1314, just before sunset on an island in the Seine. Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood chained to a wooden post, the flames licking upward with the slow deliberation of official execution. Eyewitnesses say he did not scream, that he looked directly at the horizon as the fire took him, and just before the heat silenced him forever, he spoke. His final words have echoed through history, embroidered in myth and dramatized in novels. Pope Clement, King Philip, I summon you to the judgment of God. Both men curiously died within a year. The curse, if you want to call it that, stuck. But what's less well known, buried in less poetic corners of historical record, is that those weren't his only words. According to a single document preserved in the private archives of the Abbaye de Saint-Denis, now held in restricted storage at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, de Molay's full statement was longer. Not a curse, a warning. Translated from Latin, it reads, "The time of shadow returns, and the stars prepare again their shape. You have silenced the guardians, but the sky remembers." Now you might wonder how such a thing could have gone unnoticed for centuries. Why this line, if authentic, didn't appear in early chroniclers' accounts. The answer may lie in who wrote it down. The manuscript in question is unsigned, but was included in a bundle of personal notes belonging to a monk named Father Eligius, a Benedictine scribe, known for his obsessive preservation of execution details. Eligius had a reputation for writing what others preferred not to. He documented the exact sequence of breath counts during the slow strangulation of a Cathar heretic, and once spent 3 pages describing the scent of scorched hair. His account of de Molay's death was never published, but within his notes lies something singular, a short paragraph scrawled hastily in the margin. He turned not to the king nor to the priest. He looked upward, and he spoke of the sky. It's the only surviving written source that ties de Molay directly to astronomical symbolism, and it changes everything. Because if the Grand Master did in fact refer to the stars preparing their shape, then the sigil wasn't a rogue artifact. It was doctrine. A truth preserved by the highest tier of the order, a secret taken to the pyre. Now this brings us to an important historical fact, one that often slips through the cracks of the Templar narrative. In the months leading up to the arrests, de Molay made a strange journey. He traveled to Limousin, stopping at several minor commanderies, none of which were considered strategically vital. Among them was a remote chapel outside Brive-la-Gaillarde, long rumored to have housed a library of forbidden texts. Records from that visit are sparse, but one phrase survives in a local land registry updated shortly after a relic not to be moved. No description, no context. Just those 6 words. Some believe that relic was the last sigil or a copy of it. Now, the obscure detail that very few historians connect is this: de Molay was not merely the military leader of the order. He was also its highest ritual authority. He oversaw all initiation ceremonies for senior members, and during his tenure the Templars altered part of their private liturgy. A version of the rite of the sword was shortened, and a new element introduced a moment of silence beneath the night sky. It was never recorded why. One surviving version of this revised rite contains a curious instruction. When the stars align with the broken sign, the mouth shall not speak. It was meant as metaphor. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was encoded instruction, an initiatory clue for those charged with preserving something sacred and deeply dangerous. There is a larger question, and it still divides even the most sympathetic Templar scholars. What did de Molay believe was coming? Was the prophecy he referenced apocalyptic in the religious sense? The return of Christ, the end of an age, or was it something else? Something not quite divine and not entirely human. Let's return to that phrase, "the sky remembers." In esoteric Templar writings, again most heavily suppressed after the arrests, the heavens were not seen merely as a canvas of God's creation. They were seen as a record, a clock, a scroll of divine recurrence. The stars did not just shine, they signaled, they remembered, and the sigil, if interpreted correctly, could read them. That might explain why de Molay said nothing of earthly revenge. He didn't curse his enemies with disease or fire. He pointed upward. He invoked not justice but alignment, which brings us to the final mystery. After de Molay's execution, a strange document surfaced within a small monastery in Aragon. It was unsigned but bore the Templar seal. It read, "The key has turned. The last guardian has spoken. The rest shall lie in shadow until the wheel returns." It wasn't widely circulated. It disappeared from the public record for nearly 600 years. And yet, when Langlois opened that sealed box in Bézieux in 2001, he is said to have written only one sentence in his personal notes before going silent. That sentence, "The wheel is turning again." A subtle callback, perhaps, or a confirmation that what de Molay saw was real, that the stars he referenced weren't metaphor but mechanism. So when you picture the fire rising around him, don't imagine a man defeated. Imagine a man watching the sky not in fear but in recognition, as if the fire didn't consume him but initiated the next turn of the wheel, and now that wheel comes round once more. You might imagine the Vatican archives as a place of musty old books, a vault of yellowed parchment and theological footnotes. But behind its stone facade lies something more guarded, more curated, a maze of omission. What is preserved in those depths isn't just holy scripture or papal decrees. It's a record of what the Church decided the world was not ready to know. And among those forgotten shelves, in a climate-controlled drawer, buried 3 levels below the Sala Indice, rests a set of trial transcripts that should never have survived. They're known collectively as the Confession Scrolls. Dated between 1308 and 1311, they were part of the long, grinding Inquisition against the Knights Templar, hundreds of testimonies extracted under various degrees of persuasion, most of them brutal. The Church would later disavow some of these methods, but the documents remained, archived, redacted, sealed. In 1913, Pope Pius XI authorized a quiet internal inventory of unexamined Templar records. The team included a young Jesuit scholar named Lorenzo Gaspari. He had a talent for languages, a weakness for forbidden texts, and a very short career. Because what Gaspari found, and what he attempted to publish before being silenced, was a scroll labeled De Septimo Signaculo, of the 7th seal. Now let's be clear, this isn't a reference to the biblical apocalypse, at least not directly. The scroll's contents, what little is publicly known, describe a rite performed in silence beneath the lion's stars by the anointed few who held no banner. The document is fragmented, scorched in places, and written in a strange hybrid of ecclesiastical Latin and Occitan. It doesn't name the sigil directly, but it speaks of the circle of broken symmetry and the iron tongue that speaks only when the stars align. Gaspari recognized immediately that this was not standard heresy. This wasn't idol worship or inverted prayers or strange rituals involving cats. This was cosmology, prophecy, a kind of dark astronomy wrapped in medieval theological codes. He attempted to present his findings at a Jesuit academic symposium in 1914. He was politely removed from the panel. His personal notes were confiscated. His license to teach theology was revoked. A year later, he entered monastic silence. He died in 1947, alone, unpublished, but not unheard, because one page of his notes survived. It was preserved by a friend smuggled out of the Vatican in the pages of a borrowed book. That single page, now called the Gaspari leaf, contains a paraphrase of what he claimed was the scroll's final stanza. And when the crowned slow star returns, and the sixth cross is seen cracked, let not the fathers look skyward, for the sign shall not ask permission. It's not scripture, it's warning, there's more. In the mid-1990s, as part of a limited Vatican transparency initiative, a select group of researchers were granted digital access to scanned microfilm reels of these Templar documents. But when scholars reviewed the reel labeled Trial Series 17A, something strange appeared: a 6-page sequence entirely blacked out. Not just missing, but present in form and obliterated in content. 6 sheets, each marked with the Vatican seal, each stamped with one word: Silere, be silent. This is where the open question emerges: what was on those 6 pages? Why redact them in full, and why preserve them physically rather than destroy them? Some say those pages contain testimony from high-ranking Templars, not just about doctrine, but about a calendar and esoteric clock that pointed to a future celestial event. Others believe they included references to an actual object described in terms similar to the sigil. And one whispered theory never published, always denied claims that within those lines was a map, not of land, but of stars. Of course, none of this can be confirmed. The Vatican has since restricted all access to the original microfilm, citing degradation. The reel has mysteriously gone missing. Only 2 verified scans survive, and they don't include the blacked-out section. But what's harder to erase is the growing number of convergences. We now have the Bezu discovery, the Leontius manuscript, the astronomical alignment decoded from the Sigil de Mole's final skyward utterance, and now potentially the Church's own evidence that they knew. That they redacted the scroll not because it was blasphemous, but because it was correct. And here's the obscure detail, the one easily missed. The Vatican records use a very specific code when cataloging forbidden documents. It's a 3-part identifier: category, subtype, and status. The code on the De Septimo Signaculo scroll is recorded in Gaspari's surviving notes as ex cat obscura invigilare, translated roughly outside category, hidden under watch. The word invigilare is not standard. It appears only in a handful of ecclesiastical contexts, always implying long-term surveillance. It doesn't mean locked away. It means monitored. So the sigil wasn't just buried. It was followed. Which leads to a grim possibility. What if its rediscovery wasn't an accident? What if someone inside the church or adjacent to it knew exactly where it was? What if they allowed it to surface at the right time? Not to conceal it again, but to prepare for what it represents, because here's the quietest, darkest thought of all. Perhaps the sigil was never meant to be hidden forever. Perhaps the sky had to be ready. The clock had to tick down, the stars had to fall into place, and now they have. There are languages you speak, and then there are languages you feel. Languages that don't ask for grammar or alphabet, but recognition, like remembering a face you've only seen in a dream. That's what the outermost ring of the sigil seems to whisper. It doesn't read, it resonates. At first glance, those markings appear purely decorative. Tiny, tick-like grooves, spaced unevenly, some deeper than others. They form no obvious letters, no recognizable script, and no repeating pattern. But as with so much else about the sigil, meaning only emerges when you change your perspective. Tilt it, reposition the light. And suddenly the grooves fall into motion like a frozen frequency waiting to vibrate. The breakthrough came not from a historian, but from a linguist specializing in medieval initiation rites. Her name was Dr. Antonia Roux, and she had spent 2 decades studying esoteric symbols embedded in liturgical garments and monastic architecture. But her real obsession was what she called ritual compression, the encoding of complex theological ideas into visual shorthand. Symbols that meant one thing to the outer circle, another to the inner, and something entirely different to the final few. In 2005, Roux received a grainy photo of the sigil's outer band, courtesy of a former student who'd been quietly investigating the Bezu site. She didn't see noise. She saw syntax. What Roux recognized was a pattern consistent with a class of codes known as substitution matrices grids, in which a symbol or position substitutes for a concept. These were used heavily by mystical societies, including certain Cistercian enclaves and, most compellingly, late-period Templars. She cross-referenced the groove sequence against known Templar initiation ciphers, particularly those from the so-called final degree, the highest echelon of the inner circle. This was not the stuff of Dan Brown novels. These ciphers were real, attested to in surviving confessions, and uncovered in fragments on ceremonial objects. Most were geometrical in nature, lines, dots intersecting angles. Roux matched 5 sequences from the sigil exactly to entries in an obscure 1311 document, now catalogued in Portugal's National Archive as the Carta de Luz Velada, or Charter of the Veiled Light. That document was previously dismissed as symbolic gibberish, a fever dream record of an initiation rite lost to time. But now, with the sigil as key, it opened up. One sequence on the sigil matched the cipher for vigil, another for silent watch, and a third, more complex, more jagged, aligned with a phrase Roux had previously been unable to translate fully: "Star wheel reaches rest." Now the implications were staggering. This wasn't just decorative art or mathematical abstraction. The sigil's outer ring appeared to encode a final message, one reserved for those who had passed through the last veil of initiation. Not knights, not even masters, only those deemed ready for the darkest knowledge. And what is that knowledge? The Carta describes the final degree not as a ceremony of ascension, but one of contraction. The initiate is not granted new vision, but is made to close their eyes. One line reads, "He who has seen the sign must carry silence in his bones. The stars will speak louder than we may." This is the obscure detail, the true nature of the final rite. It didn't reveal cosmic truth. It instructed its guardians to prepare for something that could not be spoken aloud. A knowledge not meant to be shared, only endured. This makes sense when you consider how the sigil behaves. As we noted in earlier chapters, the disk seems to react to light and angle. Some suspect it may even have been designed to align with a very specific starlight or solar positioning. One theory from an unpublished Vatican draft, translated in part by Langlois, speculates that the sigil activates symbolically when the heavens match its engravings exactly. that the cipher isn't meant to be read in isolation, but in context. If that's true, then it leads to one chilling conclusion: the sigil's message may not have been fully decipherable until now. Here's where we return to Jacques de Molay, our sky-gazing martyr. His final revisions to the order's rituals included a strange stipulation. During the third night of initiation, candidates were to be led blindfolded beneath an open sky and asked a single question whispered by a masked figure. "Do you remember the star that does not move?" The Polaris reference is obvious. But if Rue is correct, this wasn't a literal question. It was a test of conceptual symmetry. Polaris, unlike the wandering planets, is fixed, constant, the unmoving pivot of the northern heavens, and in the ciphered traditions of the inner order, it represented the silent witness, the idea that cosmic truth does not scream. It waits. It observes. This idea of silent surveillance calls back to the redacted Vatican scrolls and the final line in the Leontius manuscript, "They who watch are not seen." If these watchers existed, and if they used the sigil as a kind of encoded instruction manual, then the cipher may be more than just a prophecy. It may be a ritual timeline. Some researchers now believe that each segment of the outer ring corresponds to a time period, a phase, or a watch. A turning of the wheel. The final segment, thinner than the rest, aligns with the August 2039 celestial convergence we've already discussed. It is the last piece of the pattern. The final watch. Of course, the scholarly community remains split. Some say Rue's cipher interpretations are too speculative, her connections circumstantial. Others argue that medieval societies were obsessed with hidden messages, and any resemblance is coincidence. But there is no debating the existence of the Carta de Luz Velada, or the fact that its phrases, long believed nonsensical, now mirror engraved symbols on an object buried in 1307 and only unearthed centuries later. One skeptic pointed out it could be a very elaborate coincidence. Rue's answer, "So is a bullet and a heart valve if they meet by accident." Now the open question remains, was the cipher meant to be broken? Or was it a lock never meant to be opened again? Because if the sigil's outer ring was a coded message reserved for the final watchers, and if that message points not just to prophecy, but to participation, then we are no longer just observers of the sigil's mystery. We are its inheritors. The desert wind doesn't speak, but it remembers. In Cairo's old quarter, tucked behind a crumbling madrasa and the rusted bones of a 12th century gate, sits a fragment of a forgotten archive, an annex of the Dar al-Kutub, Egypt's national library, where rare manuscripts molder in liminal darkness. It was here in 1926 that a German Orientalist named Otto Reichenbach uncovered a collection of scrolls never meant to see the light of European scholarship. They were written in a strange blend of Arabic and Syriac, and among them was one volume that caught his eye, Al-Tajamul fi Tawakku al-Nujum, roughly translated, The Completion of the Celestial Awaiting. That title alone might have passed unnoticed had it not contained a set of diagrams, mandala-like illustrations, with intersecting geometries and planetary sigils. But it was one shape in particular that pulled Reichenbach in a six-armed cross, one arm broken, surrounded by glyphs disturbingly similar to those found on the Bezu sigil. That detail never made it into his official notes, because before he could present his findings, Reichenbach died quietly. His papers were boxed up and sent to his widow, who sold them in bulk to a private collector in Geneva. For decades, no one followed up. Until 2008, when a French archaeologist named Dr. Yvan Montreux traced the collection to a storage vault in Zurich. Inside, still pressed between tissue-thin folders, were high-resolution rubbings and sketches of the Cairo scroll, including a full rendering of the anomalous cross. And the heading above it, Al-Khatam al-Akhir, the final seal. So here's the historical fact. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the Templars established multiple contact points with Islamic scholars, particularly during truces and prisoner exchanges. The famed Templar stronghold of Safed in modern-day Israel was not just a military fortress, it was a site of negotiation. And according to some accounts of study, though the official church position was one of theological supremacy, Templar leadership often pursued knowledge wherever it could be found. Some even maintained private correspondences with Sufi mystics. One document preserved in Palermo's Royal Library describes a discussion of the skies held between a Templar knight and a muwaqit, an Islamic timekeeper responsible for determining prayer hours by celestial observation. Their dialogue focused not on salvation, but on Saturn. Why Saturn? Why the slowest, most distant of the visible planets? Because to both Muslim astronomers and Templar mystics, Saturn represented the border, the edge of divine influence, the final threshold before the unknown. This is where we must speak of the Black Sun. A term dragged through centuries of misinterpretation, the Black Sun Shams al-Aswad was not originally a Nazi symbol or an occult fantasy. In early Egyptian astronomy and Babylonian stellar theology, it referred to a dark alignment, a moment when the outer planets cast their shadows across Earth, not physically, but metaphysically. An era of delay, of pause, of silence from the heavens. And the scroll Reichenbach found in Cairo. It described a moment in which the dark crown of Saturn shall press upon the head of Virgo, and the iron tongue will awaken. That phrase should feel familiar by now. It's nearly identical to the apocalyptic line from the De Septimo Signaculo scroll in the Vatican archives. Too close to be coincidental. This is the obscure detail, the transmission of symbology across forbidden lines. Somehow, despite the religious chasm between Christian knights and Muslim astrologers, both sides recorded the same shape, the same timing, the same stellar forecast. Not as rivals, but as witnesses. So how did it get from Cairo to Carcassonne? That's the open question. In 1273, a Templar vessel departed from Acre under the command of a man known only as Frater B. His logbook, if genuine, was discovered in the wreck of a salt freighter near Marseille in 1959. It references a dark mirror taken from the east and its intended delivery to the sanctuary beyond Montségur, which places it squarely in Cathar territory. That region, already a hotbed of theological rebellion, may have provided the perfect hiding place for a relic too dangerous to keep in Templar strongholds. And Carcassonne, the fortified city just northeast of Bézieux and only a short ride from Rennes-le-Château, held an unusually high number of Templar initiates per capita. Local oral histories, dismissed by historians as fanciful peasant tales, speak of men of the Red Cross guarding the stars beneath the stone. These same tales describe a disk of heaven cracked by silence. You begin to see the Ark Cairo with its Black Sun scroll and planetary alignments, then the Mediterranean voyage, then Bézieux, then silence, and perhaps most importantly, you see the convergence of esoteric systems. In the east, the Black Sun as cosmological boundary. In the west, the Sigil as countdown. Two traditions separated by creed, united by pattern. The implication is profound. The Templars may not have invented the prophecy, they may have inherited it, which would make the last sigil not a creation, but a continuation. A vessel not of belief, but of transmission. The medium through which a celestial warning spanning cultures, languages, and centuries was preserved. And if that's true, then the Sigil's re-emergence in the 21st century is not just timely, it's timed. Because as the 2039 alignment approaches, the black sun returns. The slow crown of Saturn descends again. And the watchers, whoever they are, lean in once more, waiting. The wind shifts as you cross into Italy. And though the language changes, the prophecy does not. Long before the Templars etched warnings into metal, before Islamic astronomers mapped the dark crown of Saturn, there were the Sibyls, mystic prophetesses, who spoke in riddles from shadowed caves. Neither priestesses nor seers in the modern sense, they were considered vessels. Mouthpieces for divine truths not meant to comfort, but to disturb. Pagan, yes, but tolerated by the early church, just long enough to be absorbed, bowdlerized, and buried. Yet fragments remain, and one in particular rises like smoke from the past to meet the shape of the sigil. It's called the Cumaean Warning, found in a partial copy of the Oracula Sibyllina, dated roughly to the 2nd century CE, but recopied and annotated throughout the medieval period. The relevant passage, obscured within a flood of apocalyptic metaphor, reads, "When 6 points pierce the wheel of stars, and the watchers blink not beneath Virgo's gaze, a silence shall descend upon man's tongue. The iron mark shall stir, and the order of heaven turn backwards. It would be tempting, too tempting, to dismiss this as poetic coincidence. After all, classical prophecy is notorious for its layered ambiguities. But then comes the strange part. In 1321, an anonymous marginal note was added beside this stanza in a Latin manuscript housed at Monte Cassino. It simply says, Templum fractum, sigillum novissimum. Broken temple, last sigil, that scholars agree is no coincidence. This is the historical fact. The Templars were known to have translated and preserved select classical texts. Their scribes often worked in multilingual scriptoriums, especially in commanderies near Muslim-controlled territories, where Greco-Arabic scientific manuscripts were abundant. The presence of a Sibylline fragment in a Templar archive is not outside the realm of possibility. And here's where it gets even stranger. Another marginal note, this one found in a battered volume held at the Abbey of Farfa, suggests that certain Templars considered the Sibylline books not as pagan heresy, but as veiled prophecy from the same divine source they worshipped. God, the monk writes, speaks not only through saints, but through echoes. And what better echo than the stars? This brings us to the obscure detail, a parchment found in Avignon in 1967 folded between pages of unrelated land tax records. It bore no title but included a diagram, a circle with 6 spokes, one snapped, and a Latin phrase beneath Oracula rotantur sicut astra, et tempus sicut ferum se frangit. Prophecies turn as the stars do, and time like iron will break itself. Now, where have we heard that before? The matching symbolism is eerie. The 6-armed wheel, one arm broken. The references to iron and silence. The proximity of Virgo. The repetition of themes across radically different traditions. Templar Islamic classical points not to cultural coincidence but to convergence. The open scholarly debate, however, lies in the interpretation. Some argue the Sibylline fragments were misused, reinterpreted through a medieval Christian lens to justify apocalyptic expectations. That the Templars, under pressure from persecution and betrayal, began to see themselves as guardians of a cosmic truth, appropriating symbols from wherever they could, to construct a narrative of final warning. Others suggest something more unsettling. That the Templars were not cobbling together myth from panic, but responding to an actual tradition they encountered. A line of thought that stretched from Delphic utterances to Babylonian stargazers through Sufi mystics and Coptic scribes, all referencing the same event. A skyborn turning, a fracture in the order of time. And where does the sigil fit into all this? If you believe the convergence theory, then the sigil is the medium. A condensation of eschatological ideas transmitted through centuries of sacred geometry. Not just a Templar relic, but a glyph encoded with ancient expectation. One scholar, Dr. Silvano Marchesi of the University of Bologna, went so far as to claim that the sigil is a Sibylline engine, a symbolic device meant to fulfill prophecy, not by speech, but by precision. The Sibyls sang the song, he wrote. The Templars built the instrument. That theory would be laughable, if not for one final detail. In the Vatican's restricted index beneath a now sealed category once called Codices Obscurae, lies an inventory of confiscated items from 1312. One is described as a wheel of iron engraved with stars and notations suspected of demonic origin. The note attached refers to it being of Eastern design, but mentioned in the writings of the Sibyl. The document, now redacted, was signed by none other than Cardinal Bertrand de Got, later crowned Pope Clement V, the same pope who orchestrated the Templars' downfall. The callback is clear: he didn't just destroy them. He took something. He knew. So now we must ask, were the Sibyls simply mythic madwomen, or were they early messengers of a pattern none of us were meant to recognize? And if so, why is it still unfolding? The stars have no religion, no doctrine, no sides, but they do have memory. And it seems they too are spinning towards something. It sits in a locked drawer in a private collection, far from museums and institutional scrutiny. Not because it's priceless, at least not in the traditional sense, but because of what it reflects, or rather what it once did. The object is a mirror, roughly oval about the size of a human face, set into a frame of obsidian black glass. The back bears an etching, not a name, not a prayer, but a pattern. And if you've been following our journey, you already know what kind of pattern. 6 arms, 1 broken, the sigil. Its provenance leads us to a name that's always whispered in the shadows of European mystery, Mary Magdalene, or rather to the legends that surround her, those whispered myths of her journey to southern Gaul after the crucifixion, the sacred feminine she supposedly carried, and the guardians who kept watch over her relics. But tonight, we're not chasing bloodlines or apocryphal romances. We're following the trail of an artifact said to be held by a group of guardians outside Rennes-le-Château, the same region where Templars once built commanderies and hid their dead in catacombs no one dares to map fully. The same ground where the box containing the last sigil was sealed behind the altar of Bézu. The mirror emerged in the late 19th century when an obscure cleric named Abbé Duret mentioned it in a letter to a fellow antiquarian. He claimed it had been preserved by a secretive order of nuns, les filles de l'ombre, the daughters of the shadow, who traced their lineage to the Magdalene's companions. According to the letter, the mirror was used during nocturnal rites to observe the return of the seal. And here's where things get strange. The abbé described the mirror not as a passive object, but as reactive. He claimed that under certain astronomical alignments, specifically when Mars rose beneath Virgo in late summer, the mirror would show not the one who looks, but the one who waits. Naturally, historians dismissed this as pious hallucination. Duret was branded unstable, his letters filed under folk legend. But in 1972, the mirror resurfaced in the possession of a reclusive Belgian collector who allowed a handful of scholars to examine it. The obsidian frame matched volcanic glass from a quarry in Anatolia, a site frequented by early Gnostic cults. The engraving on the back matched down to the radial curvature, the central geometry of the Bézu sigil. Now for the obscure detail under polarized light. The surface of the mirror reveals faint inscriptions invisible to the naked eye. These aren't words. They're points-mapped constellations, but not random. When charted, they match the sky as it would appear on August 4th, 2039. Again. That date again. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the sigil is a record, then the mirror may have been the medium, a vessel through which the encoded knowledge of the Templars or whoever came before them could be observed. Not read, not interpreted, but seen. Some have compared it to a scrying device, but that term oversimplifies it. What the mirror reflects is not future or past in the conventional sense. It's configuration, alignment, as if its sole purpose is to respond when the heavens fall into a particular arrangement. Now consider this: the mirror was always kept facing down, wrapped in black silk, stored in cedar boxes, hidden behind altars or beneath floorboards. Not because it was sacred, but because it was dangerous. That idea recurs again and again in the scattered documents surrounding the mirror. Warnings to keep it covered, instructions that it must only be unwrapped beneath silent stars, accounts from initiates who looked into it and claimed to see shapes, movements, patterns that echoed across their dreams for years afterward. Skeptical, of course. But here's the link: several of these accounts describe what they saw not as a vision, but as a fracture, a breaking of symmetry. One described the moment as a sound without sound, in the shape of a wheel. Another wrote simply, "The sky turned black and said nothing." Now recall the ciphered initiation text from the Carta de Luz Velada, which instructed, "He who has seen the sign must carry silence in his bones." The callback is deliberate, the connection growing stronger. This mirror, if it is indeed what the nuns and the abbé believed, was not a relic of Mary Magdalene at all. Or rather, it was never hers to begin with. It may have passed through the hands of her followers, preserved as a sacred object reinterpreted as divine mystery. But its function predates any Christian myth. Its geometry is older, cold, celestial. And that opens an even deeper question: who made it? Because the craftsmanship of the frame doesn't match medieval techniques. The black glass is unusually smooth for the period, more akin to obsidian polished by Mesoamerican artisans than European monastics, and the etching laser-precise, but without lasers. A recent unpublished analysis conducted quietly by a private conservation lab dated the obsidian surface to at least the 12th century, but the tools used to shape it remain unknown. No chisel marks, no tooling residue, just a single perfect form, reflective and dark, carrying an engraving no one could have made except perhaps those who understood not just form, but function. So what if the mirror wasn't for seeing yourself at all? What if it was for seeing something you weren't meant to see? Not prophecy, not gods, but timing. What if the sigil is the code, and the mirror is the reader? That would explain why the two objects separated by geography and function share the same broken geometry, why both reference the same sky date, why the deepest rituals of the Templar inner circle referred not to revelation, but to reflection. Because if you look at the sigil long enough, you don't just see stars. You start to feel observed, not by God, not by angels, but by the sky itself. It begins with music. Not the kind you hum or the kind that swells under cathedral domes, but a deeper, stranger resonance. A vibration buried in language, in rhythm, in chant. The kind of music ancient orders believed could alter the world not through melody, but through alignment. And it is in one such chant, discovered half erased, on a goatskin vellum in the ruins of a Templar priory near Freiburg, that we find perhaps the most cryptic clue in the entire Sigil mystery. A chant with no name, no composer, and no known liturgical use. A chant scholars now refer to simply as the seal of the angelic war. Let's start with the historical fact. In 1891, during a winter excavation in the Black Forest, a group of archaeologists recovered fragments of a musical manuscript stored inside a wooden reliquary box. At first glance, it resembled a typical monastic antiphonary. But something was off. The notation used an archaic pneumatic system predating Gregorian script. The language wasn't Latin, not entirely. It danced between Latin roots, Aramaic inflections, and what appears to be a constructed code, a sort of musical cipher. What drew attention was not the melody, but the imagery. Etched into the top corner of the vellum was a strange circular diagram. 6 lines radiating outward like a star. The top spoke was jagged, deliberately broken. You already know what that means. The accompanying chant described in flowing parallel phrasing a wheel of silence, a battle without voices, and the mark that binds the host of the upper sky. It was structured as a call and response, but the responder's part was absent. Silent, entirely blank, as if the second voice had been erased or had never been meant for human ears. This is where the obscure detail becomes important. Templar musical rites are rarely discussed. Most assume their rituals were all martial and architectural, but newly translated documents suggest the order practiced a unique form of chant reserved only for initiates of the inner circle. These weren't hymns of praise or repentance, they were calibrations, rituals of resonance, designed to mirror the structure of the stars. And the Freiburg fragment seems to reference one ritual above all others, la clôture du sixième rayon, the sealing of the 6th ray. A companion parchment found nearby contains a short passage in flowing script, now partially lost to decay. But the legible portion reads, "When the 6th ray is severed, the host shall not descend. Only the sign shall speak." In angelology, the term host refers to celestial beings, warriors, forces of divine order. In this context, the host shall not descend suggests a failure of connection, a celestial silence, as if something meant to arrive doesn't. It aligns disturbingly well with the phrasing from the Sibylline warnings, and again with Frater Leontius's terrified writing, "When the 6th light breaks and the host turns away." What are all these sources describing a war that does not come? A silence where thunder should be. The phrase angelic war conjures images of trumpet-blaring archangels battling demons, but in the chant, the conflict is internal. Not between beings, but between harmony and fracture. Between the expected song of the stars and the terrible moment when that song skips. And remember the mirror, the reflections that didn't match the viewer. The celestial silence, they echo the same fear, not of invasion, but of disconnection, of being cut off from something vast, structural, cosmological. One scholar, Dr. Helena Cazares of the University of Salamanca, interpreted the chant as a mourning rite, not for the dead, but for the fallen order of heaven itself. The chant does not summon angels, she wrote. It grieves their silence. And here's the twist. Cazares found a similar 6-armed symbol in a 10th century Mozarabic manuscript hidden within a marginal illumination. The same broken radial pattern, the same missing upper spoke. But in that version, the central circle bore a single word in ink, barely visible now, obmutuit. It means it fell silent. So now we ask the open question, was the sigil meant to herald some form of divine return, or to mark the moment that divine order finally stopped speaking? Because if the chant is authentic and the musical alignment is intentional, it changes everything. It turns the sigil from a countdown to a eulogy. Not for humanity, but for the architecture of the cosmos itself. A cosmic circuit breaker. A ritual marker of when the music stopped. The implications are unnerving. The broken sixth arm of the sigil may not represent physical destruction or earthly chaos. It may represent silence, the failure of alignment, the moment when the harmonic code of the universe collapses by a fraction enough to change everything. Khazara's final translation of the chant ends with the lines, "The sixth fell, the seventh closed, the host wept behind glass, and the wheel turned, alone." It recalls almost perfectly the language from the Leontius manuscript, the circle that speaks and the silence that follows the sixth. The callback tightens. The fragments scattered through chant metal cipher and prophecy all point to the same fracture. Not apocalypse in fire and fury, but apocalypse as withdrawal. The quiet collapse of something so fundamental we may not even notice it until it's gone. And what is left then? Just the sigil. Just the wheel. Turning still. Numbers don't lie. That's the comforting myth we wrap around ourselves like a blanket in the cold expanse of uncertainty. Math is clean, pure, eternal. But what happens when the numbers start whispering, "Let's return to the sigil"? We've examined its physical form, its celestial alignments, its broken symmetry. But there is something deeper. Beneath the curves and arms and engraved glyphs, beneath the ciphered outer band and the fractured cross, lies a structure so mathematically precise, it has begun to shift the focus of modern researchers from what the sigil means to what it does. The breakthrough came not from historians, but from a man who had no business with relics or prophecy. Dr. Léonard Duquesne, a Swiss-born computational theorist, first saw the sigil during a guest lecture at the École Normale Supérieure in 2015. A blurry image on a student's presentation slide. Most viewers saw old metal. Duquesne saw ratios. He requested access to the high-resolution scans of the artifact leaked copies, quietly circulating among academic forums, and ran them through a pattern recognition model typically used for analyzing cryptographic overlays in ancient papyri. What emerged stunned him. The angles between each arm of the sigil, including the fractured sixth, formed a repeating sequence of primes embedded within a golden ratio spiral. The spacing of notches around the outer ring, though seemingly irregular, aligned with Fibonacci intervals when measured at the micron scale. Even the grooves, tiny and inconsistent by eye, formed a fractal resonance when modeled three-dimensionally. It was as though the sigil was less an artifact and more an equation, encoded not with words but with recursion, harmony, collapse. One detail especially caught Duquesne's attention. At the dead center of the sigil, where the arms converge, is a tiny depression less than 2 millimeters across. He ran simulations to determine what kind of stress or wear might create such an indentation. The result? None. The mark wasn't a flaw. It was intentional. More than that, it was a focal node. Duquesne hypothesized that if the sigil were placed under light and rotated precisely, the geometry would create a lensing effect, a dispersion of light not unlike what occurs through a diffraction grating. In other words, the sigil might be a computational device, a machine not powered by electricity but by alignment, a cosmological computer with the stars as its battery. And that's where the number came in. Hidden within the rotational geometry, specifically, the angular ratio of the 5 intact arms to the broken sixth, was a mathematical constant not commonly found in medieval systems, 729. At first glance, it seemed arbitrary, but Duquesne recognized it instantly. 3 to the 6th power. 3x 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 3 or 729. Now remember the Charter of 13 coming later in this investigation, which references a ceremony performed once every 729 years. At the time, most thought it allegorical, poetic. But if that number is embedded in the sigil's very structure, if it is part of the artifact's geometry, then we are not dealing with poetic mysticism. We are dealing with a clock, a countdown set to centuries, and what sits 729 years after the dissolution of the Templars in 1310-2039, the date of the celestial alignment. Again. The convergence tightens. Here's the obscure detail most overlooked. 729 also appears in Hermetic and Pythagorean mysticism as the number of restoration, a term used in texts referencing the return of balance after catastrophic disruption. That association was never made public until Duquesne quietly published his findings in a small, peer-reviewed journal in late 2018. The article was titled, "Recurrence Engines, Geometry Fractals, and the Temporal Functions of Esoteric Devices." It received almost no attention. Then the journal was purchased, the article removed, the archive closed. A familiar pattern, isn't it? The open question among those who've seen Duquesne's data is, this was the sigil designed by someone who understood these mathematical principles? Or did it arise from a deeper, unknowable pattern? Did the Templars embed the number 729 with intent? Or did the number reveal itself to them like a whisper from the structure of time? Some believe it points to ancient knowledge. Not extraterrestrial, not magical, just old, forgotten, passed down not in words but in ratios, carried from Sumerian stargazers to Egyptian architects to Arabic mathematicians, and finally to a group of warrior monks who weren't supposed to know any of it. The callback is subtle but essential, remember. The Lissajous curves identified in the sigil's surface texture. Those curves describe harmonic oscillations, essentially wave interference. Duquesne discovered that when modeled as a 3D topography, the sigil's surface replicates a harmonic field collapse at 729 Hz. Coincidence, or was the sigil designed not only to be seen, but to resonate? You're probably wondering what happens at 729 Hz, what that frequency means. The answer is, it means nothing until it's aligned. Frequency alone does nothing, but when it is paired with structure, with geometry, with rotation, with timing, it becomes a signal, a tone, perhaps even a call. The implications are dizzying. If the sigil is a device, then what happens when it activates? What is the outcome of the countdown? Is it spiritual, astronomical, psychological, or something else entirely? Because the sigil doesn't prophesy an ending, it counts to 1, to the number of the end. And what happens next? No one has yet dared to write down. In a quiet archive room beneath the Torre do Tombo in Lisbon, filed between centuries of forgotten maritime records, there exists a document whose existence was long suspected, but never verified. A single sheet of vellum brittle with time, and inked in a peculiar blend of Latin and Galician Portuguese. Its heading reads simply, Carta dos 13 Silenciosos, the Charter of the 13 Silent Ones. It is unsigned, undated, and anonymous, but the seal pressed into the corner, though faded and half crumbled, still bears a haunting shape, a cross with 6 arms. One, as always, is broken. This charter isn't a law or an edict or even a letter. It's a ritual prescription, a set of instructions written in such terse ceremonial prose that it reads less like an administrative record and more like a code of conduct for ghosts. It describes the formation of a conclave, 13 individuals, nameless and faceless, selected once every 729 years. Their duty to tend the wheel, seal the mouth, and ignite the circle when time curls upon itself. The phrasing is maddeningly opaque. It never mentions the sigil directly, but it repeats the same numeric and geometric cues found etched into the artifact itself. And buried within the final paragraph is the most specific line of all upon the return of the six-pointed cross to the southern stone and the shadow of Saturn upon the Virgin, the watch shall resume. The circle must be spoken, not with voice, but with action. If you've been following closely, that date, 729 years, takes us once again from 1310 to 2039. That's the historical fact. The charter exists. It is archived. It is catalogued as a private devotional text of unknown sectarian origin. But behind closed doors, a number of cryptographic specialists have examined its structure and agree this is no devotional ramble. This is a countdown protocol. Here's the obscure detail that has set conspiracy-minded scholars spinning the charter, is formatted in 13 stanzas. Each stanza is 7 lines long, the total 91 lines, which just so happens to be the number of days in a single astronomical quarter of the solar year. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, 4 seasons, 4 quarters, 13 watchers. If that sounds arbitrary, consider this the inner edge of the sigil's outer ring, when divided evenly according to its etched indentations, also segments into 13 radial divisions, one of which, the 13th, is narrower than the others, and aligns with the broken arm of the cross. The same spoke where every harmonic and alignment model shows the symbolic fracture. Coincidence. At this point, the word starts to feel like denial. Now here comes the real puzzle. If 13 individuals were truly designated once every 729 years to carry this ritual forward, where are they? Who selects them? Who knows? The charter offers a strange, oblique answer. They are not chosen by man, but recognized by sign. The watchers shall not know one another until the mirror darkens. Many interpret this to mean the reappearance of the sigil activates their awareness or even their memory. A triggering device not just for prophecy, but for people. That's the open question. Are these 13 metaphorical, allegorical, or are they real, actual humans passed down through secret lineages charged with a task so ancient and so surreal it has lost all grounding in logic? A controversial 1987 manuscript from Portuguese historian Tomás Freire da Costa suggests a possible lineage. He traced records of 13 unusually connected family names, all recurring every few generations, in records around the Languedoc, Portugal axis. Not just recurring names, but similar dates of death. Clusters of passings within the same years, spaced centuries apart. According to Freire, these clusters occur roughly every 729 years. It's the kind of claim that gets you dismissed from conferences. But Freire died under strange circumstances just a year after his findings were published privately. Heart attack, they said, in the bathtub, with his notes missing. The callback, as you've no doubt felt creeping in, takes us to Frater Leontius and his lost manuscript, The Circle That Speaks, the Seal That Waits. If he was the first of the 13, it would explain his fleeing, his silence, and his cryptic prose. And if the sigil was meant to mark not just time, but activation, then the 2001 rediscovery at Bézieux wasn't a fluke. It was the bell. And here is the chilling part. One of the last lines of the charter reads, "The iron tongue shall strike not 12 but 13. And in that final hour the mirror must be turned." The iron tongue, the mirror. 13 hours. None of these references appear in standard Templar liturgy. but all of them appear separately in the various strands of the Sigil's investigation, from the mirrored artifact near Rennes-le-Château, to the silent chant of the broken angelic war, to the coded 729-year recurrence hidden in its geometry. And all of them point to the same inexorable conclusion. The sigil is not a relic. It is a mechanism. The charter is not myth. It is the manual. And somewhere, whether they know it or not, 13 individuals may be moving toward the same place, the same moment, drawn by something they cannot name. Something written in metal, in stars, in time. And when they meet, the wheel turns. The air in the Black Forest thickens after dusk. Even now, in the age of streetlights and satellites, something ancient clings to the shadows between its pines. Step far enough off the trail, and the world narrows dark trunks leaning in like conspirators, wind turning the leaves into whispers. It's easy to see why legends took root here, but one in particular reaches through time with far more than folklore. In October of 1894, a Prussian civil engineer named Dietrich Clausen was overseeing a survey project for a proposed railway extension through the southern edge of the forest near Freiburg. He kept a meticulous field journal standard practice at the time, which included measurements, weather conditions, and the occasional complaint about muddy boots or faulty equipment. But on the night of October 21st, Clausen wrote something different. He and 2 assistants had decided to camp rather than make the long return hike to the village. At around 2:40 a.m., Clausen was awakened by a low, rhythmic hum. At first he thought it was distant thunder, but as he stepped outside the tent, he saw faint torchlight through the trees flickering in a pattern. The journal entry, later recovered and archived in Berlin, describes what he saw in simple, unfanciful terms. A procession of figures, 13 in number. They wore long robes, hoods drawn. They circled a stone marked with a kind of compass star. 6 lines, 1 fractured. I could not see faces. I could not hear voices. Only the low sound like a choir humming a single note. He didn't move, didn't call out. His assistants, when asked the following day, claimed they had seen nothing. But the next evening, Clausen found a small object beside the stone, half buried in the soil. A circular pendant made of some dark metal engraved with a 6-pointed star, and at its center what looked like a planetary glyph for Saturn. He kept it, and 3 years later, he drowned in his own bathtub. His wife insisted he had become increasingly paranoid in the months leading up to his death, speaking in his sleep about turning mirrors, the tongue of silence, and a wheel that hums. Here is your historical fact. The Black Forest has long been associated with secret societies, particularly during the early modern period. Documents from the 17th century refer to midnight congregations held on solar equinoxes and rare planetary alignments. While most of these groups were local or symbolic Freemason offshoots, Rosicrucian experiments, some scholars believe one particular lineage operated in deliberate obscurity, a group known as Die Stille Wache, the Silent Watch. The term appears sparingly in Prussian police records from the 1800s, usually dismissed as rumor. But a classified memorandum, dated 1851, now declassified and housed in the Bundesarchiv, describes an intercepted letter referencing the return of the 13 and the reawakening of the fracture beneath the fir trees. The obscure detail, that letter was intercepted in Freiburg. What connects this ritual to the sigil? It's the shape. The compass star Clausen described matches precisely the pattern etched into the disc found at Bézieux. The same broken 6th line. The same radial geometry. And the planetary glyphs, particularly Saturn, are a recurring motif among watchers from Cairo to Carcassonne. But the Black Forest ritual adds a new layer: the sound. Multiple sources mention it. Not a chant, not a song, a tone. Low, harmonic, continuous. Remember the earlier analysis of the sigil's harmonic structure, the mathematical modeling that identified a 720 Hz resonance when the disk is rotated under specific light conditions. That's not a frequency humans typically chant. That's a tone, a tuning, a signal. This leads to a disturbing possibility. What if the Black Forest ritual wasn't commemorative but functional? What if those 13 hooded figures weren't just honoring an old symbol, but activating it? If the sigil is a device, and if that device responds to sound and alignment, then such rituals might not be symbolic at all. They might be keys. The open scholarly debate hinges on this interpretation. Some researchers argue the 1894 account is unreliable, dreamlike, second-hand anecdotal. But the pendant Clausen recovered has been verified. It exists. It was analyzed in 1974 by a metallurgical lab in Munich. The alloy defied classification, containing trace amounts of iridium and antimony in ratios not typical of European metallurgy. Its engraving was microscopic, laser precise, and its central indentation, nearly imperceptible, matched the recess found at the core of the sigil itself. And yet no public institution holds the pendant today. It vanished from the archive in 1981. All that remains is a black and white photograph tucked in a drawer at the Technical University of Berlin with a handwritten caption, "Uncatalogued Sample Echo Artifact." That word again, echo. Silence. Resonance. It recalls the chant from Freiburg, "The wheel turned alone," the mirror that did not reflect, the angelic seal that bound the heavens in stillness. Everything circles back. The figures in the Black Forest might have been initiates or inheritors of the Charter of 13. If so, their presence in 1894 suggests something chilling. The countdown had already begun. Preparations were underway not in churches or temples, but in the forest in secret by those who remembered what others forgot. The callback, quiet but deliberate, brings us to the recurring motif of activation: the sigil, the mirror, the chant, the sound. 13, alignment, silence, Saturn. Each element layered like concentric rings, not separate but resonant. And here's the most unsettling thought. Clausen described the figures as circling the stone in silence, yet he heard sound. He wrote, "There were no mouths, only the note." Which leads us to wonder who or what was making the sound. Because if the sigil responds to harmonic triggers, perhaps it doesn't need us to initiate it. Perhaps it only needs us to stand near it at the right time in the right place and listen. They appear in no official roles. They held no lands, wore no rank insignias, and took no part in the Order's public campaigns. Their names, if they were ever recorded, are gone. But the traces remain in slips of parchment, passing references in trial records and the margins of forgotten letters. They are the ones the records don't mention, but whom the rumors won't let go. The Watchers. In 1312, a minor Templar scribe imprisoned in Avignon named Frater Guillot was interrogated over several days. Most of his responses were mundane denials, evasion attempts at theological justification. But toward the end of the transcript, just before the session abruptly ends, he makes a cryptic statement. The Watchers are gone to the hills. The last light is theirs. No follow-up question was recorded. No clarification sought. The next day, Guillot was found dead in his cell. Suicide, they said. He had written something on the wall with bloodied fingertips. A crude circle, and beneath it, a single fractured line. Here is your historical fact. During the final years of the Templar Order, particularly after the arrests began in France in 1307, a number of knights and clerics vanished. They didn't go to trial. They didn't flee to England or Portugal. They simply disappeared. Contemporary reports estimate that nearly 15% of the Order's recorded personnel were unaccounted for by the time of the Order's dissolution. Vanishing in the 14th century was not uncommon. War, illness, shipwreck. But what makes this figure unusual is the silence. The Church spared no effort rooting out fugitives of heresy. Yet in these cases, no pursuit seems to have followed. It's as if someone higher up quietly accepted their absence. This silence has led a handful of researchers to suggest a shadow sect within the Order. Not a splinter group, but a designated role. A silent rank beyond master and preceptor. Guardians not of territory or treasure, but of knowledge. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for this theory comes from a letter dated 1325 discovered in the cloisters of a Cistercian monastery in northern Italy. The author is anonymous, but the recipient is addressed only as Custos. The letter references a prior ceremony, the turning of the mirror, and warns that the circle has spoken sooner than the chart foretold. But the signature is the real puzzle. Not a name, not a title, just a symbol. A six-pointed star with one spoke broken. This is the obscure detail. The Watchers may never have called themselves that. The term appears only in whispers retrofitted by later scholars. But the geometry persists. The fractured arm, the circle, the silence. One document, the so-called Canticle of the Hidden Ones, was smuggled out of Avignon in the early 1700s and is held today in a private collection in Antwerp. It's part poem, part ritual instruction, and describes a role performed not during the glory of the Order's rise, but during its fall. A final generation of guardians instructed to preserve not symbols, but timing. The refrain reads, "We do not guard the blade nor the book. We guard the hour. We are the eyes between the minutes. We are the space between the stars." This poem, found again and again in different forms across Europe, hints at a group whose function was not to fight or to preach, but to wait, to witness, and perhaps when the alignment returned to act. The question, of course, is whether they still exist. Some argue that the Watchers were absorbed into other secret societies, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, or more obscure continental orders. But the symbols don't align. Most modern secret societies chase ideals, power, enlightenment. The Watchers, if the documents are to be believed, had no interest in power. Their loyalty was to time itself. A more unsettling theory posits that they were generational, that the role was passed silently through bloodlines or sacred oaths reactivated only at the appointed moment. One passage from the Codex Leontius, yes, that same manuscript from our lost brother, mentions a cycle of 13 threes, which some interpret as a reference to 39 Watchers spread across history, activated in phases. We recall now the Charter of 13. If that document indeed prescribes a ritual to be performed once every 729 years, it's possible the Watchers function as timekeepers, ensuring that when the cycle resets, the components are in place. Not a congregation, a circuit. The callback tightens here. The Black Forest ritual, the mirror, the number 729, the harmonic resonance. In each instance, we've seen echoes of timing, of coordination. But who coordinates, who watches the stars? Who returns to the same ritual site century after century? Perhaps those who have always watched. And perhaps they've been closer than we think. One final note: in 2002, shortly after the discovery of the Sigil at Bazou, a sealed envelope was mailed to the French Ministry of Culture. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside was a slip of paper with a single line. "It is not too early. It is precisely now." Beneath the line, 13 dashes, one broken. If that letter is genuine, then the Watchers are not gone. They are awake. And the clock they have tended across centuries is now finally ticking audibly. And if they are watching, then perhaps we are being watched. It's easy to forget that the Templars had ships. Most remember the Order's gleaming swords, war-hardened fortresses, and vaults full of gold. Fewer recall that they maintained a vast maritime network, coastal commanderies, inland river ports, entire fleets of vessels operating not just in the Mediterranean, but in the North Atlantic. They weren't just fighting wars in the Holy Land. They were moving people knowledge and perhaps relics. And one voyage stands out like a ripple in the sea of silence that followed the Order's collapse, a final journey north toward the land of ice. The historical record here is frustratingly thin. But in a 1343 naval logbook recovered from the archives of the Hanseatic League misfiled among grain contracts, there is a single inexplicable entry. A scribe noting the arrival of a small ship at Bergen, Norway, writes 3 men foreign bearing a sign of red upon white requesting no lodging. Said to be on pilgrimage to Norderljos. Norderljos, the Old Norse word for northern lights. This is the first breadcrumb. From there, the trail turns glacial. Almost literally. A 15th century Icelandic saga, Gudmundar Söngvar, includes an unusual passage describing strange monks from the southern seas who built no chapel but studied the sky and carved wheels into the stone. The locals called them Stjörnuvörður, star watchers. No names, no dates, just rumor. But in 2009, during construction near the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, a region long associated with volcanic energy and mythic pilgrimage, archaeologists uncovered a stone slab buried face down beneath a collapsed lava shelf. It bore no runes, no Viking symbology. But carved into its face was a perfect circle with radial lines, 6 arms, 1 truncated. The Templar geometry. The slab is now housed in the National Museum of Iceland. Its existence has been publicly acknowledged, though its design has not. Officially, it's catalogued as medieval cosmographic unknown. Unofficially, it's become the focal point of one of the most obscure theories in the Sigil mystery, that the Templars in their final days established an astronomical observatory in Iceland, not for worship, but for alignment. Let's dig into that. During the 13th and 14th centuries, Iceland was not the frozen backwater many imagine. Monasteries flourished, the sky was unparalleled in clarity, and most significantly, the North Pole's axial precession was beginning to shift into its current orientation, making this latitude uniquely suited for tracking long-cycle celestial events. You remember the number 729. The countdown encoded in the sigil. That's not a human scale of time. That's stellar time. And to measure stellar time, you need the right vantage point. This is your historical fact in the early 14th century. A set of astronomical texts arrived in Iceland from unknown sources. These manuscripts, written in Latin, used terminology inconsistent with Islamic astronomy, Greek scholarship, or even early Western observations. One of them includes diagrams showing Saturn's synodic cycle plotted across 8 centuries. It also features a star chart annotated in a cipher that, when rotated through a Caesar shift of 13 characters, spells out the word sigillum, seal. The obscure detail here is a footnote written in a different hand added centuries later. It reads, "This map is not for navigation, it is for preparation." So what were they preparing for? This is where the callback becomes unavoidable. The mirror, the chant, the watchers, the number of the end. Each thread hints at a timing mechanism, an event locked to a specific celestial rhythm. And if that's the case, the Templars would have needed a place to monitor that rhythm. Somewhere isolated, stable, dark. Iceland fits. Now consider this. A map known as the Carta Marina, published in 1539 by Olaus Magnus, depicts the North Atlantic in meticulous detail. But near the western coast of Iceland, a tiny unlabeled island is shown bearing only an image, a wheel. No settlement, no animals, no ships, just a wheel. That map was suppressed shortly after its printing. Copies are rare, but that image has puzzled cartographers for centuries. Some call it an emblem of a whirlpool, others a printing error. But when overlaid with modern star maps, the wheel's position aligns with the rising point of Virgo during the 2039 alignment at that latitude on that date. Coincidence, possibly. But we've seen how coincidences accumulate in this story, like frost on old stone. The open question, what happened to this northern outpost? If the Templars built a star-watching sanctuary in Iceland, why has it left so little trace? A controversial theory circulated quietly among certain esoteric historians suggests that the site still exists, that it was abandoned, not destroyed, sealed, waiting, and that its location is encoded into the sigil itself, using longitude expressed as celestial arc minutes instead of degrees. One such researcher, Dr. John Torvik, believes the coordinates point to a cavern beneath the Snæfellsjökull volcano. He claims to have found seismic irregularities consistent with a man-made structure. He has applied for excavation permits 6 times. He has been denied 6 times. The Icelandic authorities cite environmental protection. But in 2017, a classified report leaked to a Swedish journalist revealed that the site had been designated culturally sensitive due to foreign heritage claims. It did not specify which foreign heritage. Torvik's latest appeal was marked urgent. It was filed in 2023, and as of this writing, it has not been denied. The implication lingers. The Templars, we now suspect, did more than safeguard the sigil. They mapped it, tracked it, aligned with it. Their final voyage wasn't toward conquest. It was toward calculation. And what they built in the frozen north may not have been a refuge. It may have been a trigger. Because Iceland doesn't just sit on the edge of the world. It sits on the edge of time. They weren't just accused of heresy. They were accused of listening. Among the long list of charges brought against the Knights Templar in the early 1300s, idolatry, blasphemy, secret rituals, one stands out not because of its theatricality, but because of its quiet absurdity. Several accused knights were said to have studied the movements of the heavens with tools of forbidden proportion. Not astrology, not astronomy, but geometry, sacred geometry. At the time, this was less a scientific charge than a spiritual crime. Geometry was sacred only when it built cathedrals or calculated feast days. But when used to map the sky, or worse, to predict its movements, it stepped into territory the Church considered dangerous, presumptuous, subversive. Because what if the heavens weren't divine chaos? What if they were patterned? This is the historical fact. By the mid-13th century, the Templars had amassed a quietly growing collection of mathematical manuscripts. These included translated copies of Euclid Arabic texts from Al-Andalus and geometric treatises smuggled from Byzantium. Most were held in commanderies far from Rome's oversight, especially in Portugal and southern France. But one scroll known only as Sphæra Obscura has become central to understanding why the Church may have feared the Templars even more than it let on. The scroll, recovered in 1906 from the ruins of a Templar outpost near Tamar, Portugal, contains diagrams that resemble nested circles, spirals, and intersecting arcs. But when fed through modern modeling software, the images resolve into a kind of harmonic map, one consistent with orbital resonance patterns between Earth, Mars, and Saturn over multi-century intervals. In short, it's a model of planetary timing, Now here's the obscure detail that makes this scroll impossible to dismiss in one corner. Scratched in a slightly different ink is a peculiar phrase in Latin audivimus sphaeras fractas loqui in silentio. We heard the broken spheres speak in silence. It is nearly identical to language found in the seal of the angelic war chant, and again in the Leontius manuscript. The idea of broken celestial music, of disrupted harmony. This brings us to the so-called music of the spheres. In medieval cosmology, especially within Neoplatonic and early Christian traditions, it was believed that the movements of the planets generated a kind of divine music, not audible, but real, a harmony of orbits, a metaphysical symphony. But the Templars, it seems, believed the music had changed, that a note had gone silent. Several trial confessions, brutally extracted and dismissed for centuries, mention the disharmony and the wounded star. One even refers to a ritual where initiates were asked to draw the chord, that no longer sounds, followed by a period of enforced silence in the dark. What were they hearing? Or more precisely, what weren't they hearing anymore? Let's return to the sigil. You already know that its geometry, its broken sixth arm, its radial balance is more than symbolic. When modeled digitally, the sigil generates an imperfect harmonic field. It rings wrong. That's not metaphor. When laser scanned and processed through frequency analysis software, the sigil's shape generates overtones inconsistent with balanced radial forms. It doesn't resonate properly. And yet this flawed resonance matches precisely the pattern described in Sphera Obscura, a field warped along a Saturnine arc. Saturn again, always Saturn. The callback is inevitable. From the mirror's darkened surface to the silent chant to the Icelandic observatory, everything points to a celestial structure that has been damaged, misaligned. And if you believe the Templars and their mysterious watchers, that misalignment is not metaphorical, it's mechanical. It brings us to the open question scholars rarely ask aloud: what if the music of the spheres wasn't just a poetic idea? What if it was real, not a sound, but a force, a synchronization, a system of cosmic ratios that held time, matter, and perception in alignment? And what if that system is breaking? The sigil viewed through this lens becomes more than a warning. It becomes a diagnostic, a device built not to protect or summon, but to measure. And perhaps, when the time is right, to respond. There's one more layer. In a little-known appendix to the Templar interrogation records compiled in 1311, a scribe notes a phrase uttered by a dying knight. He had been burned at the stake in Toulouse, and as the flames climbed his robe, he screamed, "The sixth arm fell." The wheel cracked. The song is dead. 3 sentences. Disconnected, or a confession far deeper than theology. So we ask ourselves if the sigil marks a moment in the future when celestial harmony will fracture, when the silent music of the universe stutters. What happens then? What happens when the spheres no longer sing? Some believe this moment is not catastrophic, that it's evolutionary, a cosmic shift in perception, a new age as mystics might call it. Others fear its collapse, that the fabric of time itself, held together by resonant forces beyond our comprehension, might ripple or rupture. And then there are those who insist the sigil doesn't just observe, it compensates, that when the harmonic break occurs, the sigil does something, corrects, or initiates, or ends. Because heresy, as the Church defined it, was never just about belief. It was about control. And the greatest heresy of all may have been this: the idea that the heavens weren't a mystery to be feared, but a machine to be understood. When the sun disappears, time seems to pause. Across every culture, every era, eclipses have held a sacred kind of terror. From ancient Babylon to Qing dynasty China, the sudden vanishing of daylight has always meant more than a trick of celestial mechanics. It was omen, interruption, a break in the regular order of things. So when the sigil's radial geometry was first cross-referenced with eclipse maps from the past millennium, few expected anything remarkable. The disk was assumed to be planetary, concerned with alignments, not occlusions. But then came the revelation: two eclipses centuries apart, positioned at perfect opposing arcs on the sigil's outer ring. One in 1347, one in 2039, and between them exactly 729 years. That number again. Let's begin with the historical fact. On May 3, 1347, a total solar eclipse darkened a broad swath of southern Europe, including Languedoc. Records from the time, written in a mix of Latin and Occitan, describe the light gone still, the birds silenced, and a second dusk. One chronicler, writing from Carcassonne, claimed the sky trembled as if remembering something. Later that same year, the Black Death began its catastrophic spread across Europe. Now fast forward. On July 23, 2039, a total solar eclipse will again pass directly over Europe, this time cutting diagonally across the continent, casting shadow across parts of Spain, southern France, and into northern Italy. The path of totality will graze within 40 kilometers of Bézieux. Two eclipses. Same region, same rotational alignment on the sigil's geometry. Same timing interval, 729 years apart. But this isn't just poetic symmetry, it's astronomical. The obscure detail here is the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, 11 days and 8 hours after which eclipses repeat in a similar pattern. The two eclipses in 1347 and 2039 do not fall within the same Saros cycle. They are separated by over 40 Saros generations. This makes their alignment not predictable, but unique. And yet the sigil encodes them both. Dr. Jian Mei, an astrophysicist at the University of Leiden, conducted a modeling experiment in 2016. Using precise eclipse path data from NASA and advanced simulation tools, she overlaid the Bézieux sigil onto a polar projection of the Earth's eclipse map. The results were shocking. The broken arm of the sigil, the same fracture we've traced across chants, ciphers, and celestial schematics, aligned within a half-degree of both eclipse paths' center lines. May did not publish her findings in a mainstream journal. She cited academic pressures. But in a private interview, she said, "It is either deliberate or impossible," which leads to a chilling possibility. What if the sigil wasn't only tracking planetary motion, but eclipse recurrence? What if it was designed to mark not where the light shines, but when it vanishes? This ties into a fragment found in the Codex of Leontius, where he writes, "The hour of shadow will be twice. The first to silence the world, the second to speak the seal." Many dismissed this as allegory, but recontextualized through the twin eclipse theory, it begins to sound eerily literal. The first eclipse, 1347, preceded an apocalyptic event, not a prophecy, a plague, a restructuring of civilization. The second eclipse, 2039, has yet to occur, and the question lingers. Will it herald another turning? The callback here is unavoidable. The number of the end, 729 years. The seal of the angelic war, silence descending. The mirror, the chant, the star watchers in Iceland, all looking not merely for light, but for the fracture in its rhythm. Here's where it gets stranger. A medieval astronomical codex stored in the Bodleian Library, and rarely viewed outside of private request, includes an anonymous marginalia note written beside a solar diagram. It reads, "Let the dark kiss come twice before the circle breaks. Then shall the last key hum." Again that sound motif, that low vibration, That idea that the sigil is waiting for a precise moment when the light disappears, when the hum returns, when something opens. Now for the open scholarly debate. Are these eclipse alignments intentional, or the result of pareidolia seeing pattern where none exists? Duquesne's work on resonance suggests otherwise. His modeling shows that the sigil's geometry, when viewed as a harmonic device, reacts most violently to simulated solar occlusion at the same angular tilt as the eclipse paths. That's not just visual metaphor, that's interference. The sigil's ring, that subtle, inaudible frequency, destabilizes when subjected to eclipse-modeled light fluctuation. In simpler terms, it responds when the sun vanishes. This has led to wild speculation that the sigil might have been designed to do something at the moment of eclipse. Activate, emit, initiate. But what would it initiate? Theories range from spiritual awakening to catastrophic collapse to the revelation of hidden perception. One group operating under the name Chronostellum believes the twin eclipses represent a gateway. A cosmic hourglass flipped once in 1347 and ready to be turned again in 2039. They've created simulations predicting gravitational anomalies, electromagnetic field disturbances, and even shifts in human brainwave activity coinciding with eclipse conditions. All speculative, all denied by mainstream science, but none disproven. So now we must confront the thought lurking behind every line of this investigation. What if the Templars saw this? What if they knew, not in vague prophetic language, but in measurements, in astronomy, in long-forgotten models inherited from older, more obscure traditions, perhaps from Egyptian star priests, or Babylonian mathematicians, or even earlier? And what if the sigil is not a memory of those predictions, but the instrument of their fulfillment? 2 eclipses, 2 silences, 1 last seal, and the light between them running out. It was made of iron, not gold, heavy, dull, and without ornament save for the same symbol we've seen carved in stone, etched in metal, whispered in chants, and encoded in cipher. A cross with 6 arms, the lowest one cracked, and in 1623 an English nobleman took a hammer to it. The account comes from the private journals of Sir Lionel Ashcombe, a lesser-known antiquarian and member of Parliament, whose interests skewed more toward esoteric curiosities than statecraft. Among his many collections, animal skulls, alchemical folios, fragments of Roman coins, was one item that remained locked away in a cedar box for over a decade. A ring too large to wear comfortably, discovered in the ruins of a chapel on the Ashcombe estate in Northumberland. It was his grandfather's land, and according to family lore, the ring was unearthed in 1598, buried beneath the collapsed altar stone alongside a piece of broken black glass, and a scroll so faded it flaked to dust upon exposure. But the ring remained. Lionel's notes describe it in terms that border on obsessive, not a thing of beauty, but of purpose. A wheel malformed. The 6th break unsettles me. He sketched it dozens of times, always fixating on the broken arm, how deliberate it looked, as though it had been struck or perhaps designed that way. This is your historical fact. In the early 1600s, England experienced a brief but intense resurgence of interest in forbidden knowledge. Alchemy, geomancy, angelic languages, anything deemed unfit by ecclesiastical law, became magnetized with allure. The Ashcombe ring would have fit right in. But Sir Lionel didn't display it. He didn't write about it publicly. He didn't share it with his fellow collectors. Instead, he kept it locked away until, as his diary records, the wheel turned and the stars fell ill. What did he mean? On August 12, 1623, a triple planetary conjunction occurred. Mercury, Venus, and Mars drawing close in the pre-dawn sky. Most observers saw it as a curiosity. Lionel saw it as a signal. That night, he took the ring into his study, placed it atop a mirror, and according to his own hand, waited for the silence. What followed is recorded in a letter to his sister, never sent, discovered later among his papers. It reads, "The ring sang without voice. The silence was deeper than death. I saw the sixth fall again. I feared it would open. He shattered the ring with a hammer. It took 4 blows. Here's the obscure detail fragments of the ring survive. They're held in the Ashcombe family's private collection, and in 1998 they were examined by a team of metallurgists at Oxford under limited access. Their report, quietly published in a footnote in the Journal of Historical Materials, mentions something curious. The inner surface of the band bore an engraving too fine to be seen with the naked eye. When magnified, it revealed a spiral composed of 13 dots. 1 misaligned. 13. Again. This pulls the thread directly back to the Charter of the 13, the Watchers. The harmonic resonance of the sigil and the countdown of 729 years. The callbacks are no longer subtle, they're recursive, but the Ashcombe ring introduces a new element: fear. Not symbolic, not theoretical. Physical. Real. Lionel, by all accounts, a rational man, believed the object to be dangerous. Not in the way a sword or a poison is dangerous, but in the way a key becomes dangerous when it no longer fits a lock, and instead turns something else. The open question becomes, was the ring part of the sigil system a control, a trigger, a duplicate? Was it one of many, a personal relic passed down from one watcher to the next? A secondary account recorded in the journals of Lionel's manservant Ewan Beck adds a chilling detail. Beck writes that after the ring was broken, Lionel stopped sleeping. He sat by the fire for hours, mumbling about the 6th line, the silent circle, and the hum inside the shadow. He grew pale, twitchy, insisted the stars had shifted, that the mirror was facing the wrong way. 3 weeks later, Lionel Ashcombe was dead, officially heart failure. But Beck's last entry, he died with his mouth open, as though still listening. The idea that a physical object could channel something, that the sigil's symbols are not just representations, but invitations, is not new. We've seen it with the mirror, the chant, the Icelandic stone. But the ring is different. It was wearable, it was personal. It may have marked an individual like the Watchers, or operated as a kind of harmonic token, one piece of a distributed mechanism scattered across centuries. Designed not to be used, but to wait, and perhaps to warn. Because if Lionel's journal is to be believed, he didn't destroy the ring out of superstition. He destroyed it to stop something, to silence a signal, to prevent the wheel from turning again. But here's the thought that sits like a shadow behind this entire chapter. What if he was too late, or worse? What if breaking the ring wasn't a prevention, but a trigger? What if that silence he feared wasn't silence at all, just waiting? Waiting for the hum to start again. You probably haven't heard of them. That's by design. They don't wear robes. They don't build temples. They don't sell books, hold rallies, or upload cryptic YouTube sermons. In fact, they rarely speak at all. But if you know where to look, really look, you'll start to notice a pattern. They call themselves many things. The Silent Line. The Order of the Sixth Light. In some circles, they're simply referred to as continuance, a name pulled from the last page of the Leontius manuscript, that the seal might continue even when forgotten. They operate in scattered pockets across Europe and South America, but recent years have seen their presence quietly expand to North America and parts of Southeast Asia. They don't evangelize. They don't ask for money. What they do instead is observe and gather. Let's start with the historical fact. In 2012, during renovations to a 19th-century Jesuit seminary near Córdoba, Argentina, workers uncovered a locked chest sealed with lead. Inside were 13 small notebooks, identical in size and formatting, though penned in different hands. Their contents: diagrams, celestial maps, dates, recurring references to eclipses, Saturnian cycles, and planetary syzygies. And this phrase repeated across almost every volume: the seal is not a relic. It is a rhythm. Those notebooks are now part of a private archival collection. The Argentine government listed them officially as esoteric instructional materials of uncertain origin. But a digital leak in 2016 revealed scans of several pages. Page 9 of Notebook 5 depicts a familiar shape, 6 arms radiating from a circle, the bottom right one fractured. Again. But what's more intriguing is what came after the leak. Within weeks, 3 individuals reached out to the archivist anonymously, all separately, all fluent in obscure medieval Latin, all claiming prior access to the notebook's contents, despite them never having been publicly viewed before, and each signed their email with the same symbol, a broken ring encircling 13 dots. This is the obscure detail. These contacts didn't request access. They requested return. They claimed the notebooks were stolen during the transition and had been meant for the safe watchers. The phrase itself means nothing unless you recall Section 17 and the canticle of the hidden ones. We are the eyes between the minutes. If they are to be believed, then these people don't just believe in the sigil. They're continuing its work. It gets stranger. In 2020, a security researcher named Maya Veer uncovered an encrypted subdomain attached to an otherwise unremarkable historical preservation website in Bruges. Behind layers of obfuscation, she found a trove of data: astronomical ephemerides, acoustic modeling charts, eclipse maps stretching into the 24th century. There were scanned images of locations we've discussed before: the Snæfellsjökull site in Iceland, the Freiburg Forest, the Bezu altar. Even the shattered Ashcombe ring captioned in Latin "one falls to speak the next." And then came the calendar. A countdown updated daily, ticking toward August 4th, 2039. She posted a single image on a private forum. It was removed within hours. Her system was hacked, her files corrupted, and she received a cease and desist notice from a legal firm that doesn't exist. She's since disappeared from digital life. Here's where the open question arises, and it's less academic now than existential. Are these modern groups the direct descendants of the Templar Watchers? Have they inherited their charge through bloodline ritual or merely belief? Or have they found the sigil on their own, drawn to it not by tradition, but by resonance? That word again. Resonance. The sigil doesn't broadcast. It pulls. It hums softly on a channel few can hear. Those who do describe dreams, shifts in perception, visions of wheels, rings, and mirrors. Many feel it before they see it, which leads to the possibility that these revivalists aren't inheritors, they're receivers. And the signal, it's getting stronger. One documented case is particularly compelling. In 2017, a French cartographer named Lucien de Roches disappeared while mapping a forest near Montségur. When his belongings were recovered, his GPS unit showed an unnatural walking pattern, perfect concentric circles, around a central point marked only as X. Beneath that, X searchers found nothing. But etched faintly into the bark of a nearby tree was the 6-armed sigil. Desroches was later found unharmed 30 kilometers away. He had no memory of walking, but when shown a photograph of the sigil, he wept. A callback here is unavoidable. The Black Forest ritual, the mirrored chant, the Watchers in Iceland, the count of 13, all functioning as quiet circuits in a system of belief or perception centuries in the making. But now that system is stirring, not in temples, not in books, in people, in minds, in movement. There's a final quiet theory whispered by those who've studied the Sigil their entire lives that the revivalists aren't organizing because of the Sigil's rediscovery. They're organizing because the Sigil is almost ready, as if it's more than metal, more than symbol. As if with each echo of alignment it draws its keepers to itself, not by voice, by rhythm, by design, by the hum that slowly begins again. You might not hear it, not yet, but something is ticking, not the clocks we wear or the ones that haunt our kitchen walls, not even the atomic pulses that keep satellites in sync. This ticking belongs to something deeper, slower, and vastly older. It belongs to the Sigil, because if everything we've traced so far holds true, if the geometry, the eclipses, the resonance, the watchers, the charter, and the alignment are real, then the Sigil isn't just a warning. It's a clock, and it's almost out of time. The historical fact is simple and chilling. Every major thread of this investigation converges on a date, August 4th, 2039. A planetary alignment, a returning eclipse, a harmonic cycle 729 years in the making. We've seen how the Sigil encodes this moment in metal, how the charter anticipates it, how the chants describe its resonance, and how those who have tried to break the circuit have failed. But what no one can agree on is what happens next. This is where theory begins to tremble under the weight of possibility. Some say nothing will happen. That the Sigil is symbolic, an echo of medieval pattern obsession, amplified by modern paranoia. Just geometry, just myth, just a cold relic with a nice story. But the data disagrees. In the last 20 years, there has been a measurable uptick in global electromagnetic disturbances during minor planetary alignments. Most are explained away: solar flares, magnetic anomalies, local interferences, but some remain unaccounted for. A 2014 study buried in a minor physics journal documented a set of unexplained harmonic spikes in the ELF extremely low frequency range over Central Europe during a Saturn-Mercury conjunction. The frequency, 729 Hz. No follow-up study was published. Here's the obscure detail: a satellite launched in 2017 to monitor deep space cosmic background radiation experienced a 4.3-second data blackout while crossing directly over the coordinates of Bézieux, France. The team reported a momentary signal saturation of unknown origin. When asked if it could be solar interference, the lead technician reportedly laughed. "It came from below," he said. Now for the callback, the watchers, the revivalists, the sealed sites, the quiet rituals. Every action traced across these chapters has been building toward something. Not a vague expectation, but a moment, an hour. And the Sigil, if it is a machine, as some believe, is not counting down indefinitely. It's designed for precision. It's been waiting for a specific intersection of time, space, and resonance. 2039. So what happens when the clock stops? One theory from the leaked notes of Dr. Antonia Roux suggests a massive shift in perception. That the Sigil's function is neurological. That its resonance, when activated by eclipse shadow and planetary frequency, induces a global cognitive phase shift. Not hallucination, not madness, but a collective attunement to a new harmonic framework. A waking. Others fear the opposite. That the Sigil's activation represents not a beginning, but a cancellation. That it encodes a shutdown, a collapse of the harmonic lattice that stabilizes perception time or even matter. That the seal is not protecting us from knowledge, but protecting reality from us. The most disturbing theory comes from the unpublished pages of Frater Leontius recovered in fragments from the Montségur site. His final line scrawled beneath the symbol of the fractured sixth arm reads, "It is not death, it is unbeing." The wheel turns and the mirror forgets. There's something terrifying about that phrase, "the mirror forgets." If the sigil encodes the structure of reality, then perhaps its activation represents a reordering so complete that memory itself becomes unmoored. Imagine a moment in which time resets not backward, not forward, but sideways, where the alignment triggers a harmonic reboot, where the watchers aren't preparing for apocalypse, but for reinitialization, a system update. But of what the open question is no longer what is the sigil. We've answered that. The sigil is a device. It measures. It resonates. It remembers. The real question now is, what happens when it remembers everything at once? And who or what will be watching when it does? Because when the clock stops, it doesn't just mark the end of waiting. It marks the beginning of whatever comes next. And the sky turning slowly above us doesn't ask if we're ready. It just waits. You've followed it this far, across 13 centuries through dust-choked vaults and forgotten chants, across eclipse paths and icy ridges and broken rings. And now, here at the edge of understanding, we have to ask the most dangerous question of all. What was the sigil for not what it meant, not what it symbolized, but what it was designed to do? Because one truth has emerged from the chaos, the sigil is not inert. Its patterns, alignments, and harmonic structures aren't the result of random medieval obsession. They're purposeful, consistent, precise, and they're converging. So now we come to the theory, the one that knits every fragment together. The sigil is not a relic. It's a trigger, not for war, not for destruction, but for activation. Let's pull the threads tight. The fractured sixth arm echoing across carvings, ciphers, rings, and rites. The countdown of 729 years recited in chants encoded in planetary cycles. The watchers who vanished, the revivalists who returned. The mirror that doesn't reflect. The clock that doesn't tick. And the hum, the inescapable, inaudible vibration that recurs in every document, testimony, and dream. Put plainly, the sigil wasn't made to tell us something. It was made to do something. And that something is approaching. The historical fact sits heavy at the center of it all. Every layer of the Templars' final century, its cryptic rituals, geographic expansion, sudden dissolution, points not toward accumulation of power or protection of treasure, but the management of time. Of knowledge so dangerous it couldn't be stored in libraries or words. It had to be locked inside recurrence, ritual, geometry. You've seen how it works. The sigil's outer ring encodes planetary resonance, its broken arm tracks eclipse symmetry, its harmonic frequency collapses at 729 Hz, the same frequency projected across the 2039 celestial alignment. Duquesne's modeling ruse cipher translation and the Icelandic Observatory's seismic map all confirm it. The sigil's core is built around event convergence, a point where astronomical alignment, temporal recursion, and symbolic ritual meet. This is the obscure detail almost no one catches. The sigil wasn't made to record an ending. It was made to initiate it. An ending may not mean what you think. A passage from the Charter of 13 speaks of a gate not between places, but between arrangements. Another fragment from the Gaspari leaf reads, "The wheel does not open to space but to ordering." Even Frater Leontius, as terrified as he was, wrote, "The fracture is not death, it is reassembly." This brings us back to the idea that the sigil functions not as a weapon or warning, but a cosmic switch, a tuning fork for consciousness, or perhaps reality itself. If you believe the sigil is a trigger, then what it triggers isn't fire or ruin, it's transition. A phase shift, a reharmonization of the pattern that underlies the sky, the mind, and the mirror between them. The callback now becomes a convergence. The silent watchers, the angelic seal, the Icelandic sanctuary, the revivalist calendar, the Black Forest procession, the Sibylline prophecy, all describe not annihilation, but alignment. They all speak of the moment when the mirror turns. The open question, the one that cannot yet be answered, is what lies on the other side. Is it illumination or erasure, evolution or silence? There is no consensus. There is only recurrence. Echoes through architecture, through chant, through stone and metal and dream. The sigil appears wherever it is needed, like a blueprint for a machine that hasn't yet been built, or like a memory we are only now beginning to remember. And if 2039 is the moment it finishes remembering, then so must we, because that is its purpose: to survive time, to synchronize the human mind with something older, vaster, and incomparably quiet. And now the stars approach their appointed angles. The hum beneath silence grows louder, and the sixth arm, still broken, still waiting, aligns once more with the shadow that turns the sky dark. This is not a symbol. It is a signal. And it is almost time. It won't be fire, or blood, or horn-blown judgment beneath a cracking sky. That's not what this has ever been about. The end of the age is not the end of the world. It's the end of the rhythm that has held the world in place. The final breath before the next begins. And if the sigil speaks true, if the hum we've traced across centuries is real, then that breath is drawing in now. What happens next may not look like anything at all. It may arrive as stillness, as a moment where the air feels slightly wrong, where birds stop mid-flight, where a mirror for 1 second doesn't reflect, where Saturn crests the shoulder of Virgo and the hum at last becomes audible, not loud, just undeniable. What the Templars feared, what they preserved, wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Because when the sigil activates, whether through resonance or ritual or cosmic clockwork, it does not destroy, it reveals. The silence. It is not absence. It is invitation. And that invitation, centuries in the making, may offer more than revelation. It may require something, a choice, a shift, an understanding of time not as line but as wheel, as harmony, as a song we've forgotten how to hear. Perhaps the age that ends in 2039 is not ours. Perhaps it's theirs. The watchers, the builders, the ones who waited not for us to act, but for us to notice. Because nothing waits forever, not even silence. And when the sigil hums its final tone, what echoes back may be the shape of what we become. So rest now. You've followed the signs. You've heard the silence. You've stood beneath the stars and felt the old geometry press inward like breath held too long. Let it go. Let the wheels turn. And when the light bends strangely across the sky, when the hour slows and the shadow leans a little longer than it should, do not be afraid. The age is ending. You are still here, and the stars remember you. Slowly now. Let it all dissolve. The maps, the echoes, the whispering stone. Let them fall like leaves onto water floating out of reach. The sigil turns, but you don't need to chase it anymore. You've seen its shape, felt its pull, heard its quiet question hidden between centuries, and now it can rest, and so can you. Breathe out. Let the last circle close. Let the mirror forget. Let the silence return not as loss, but as rhythm. You are no longer a seeker. You are part of the hum. Good night.